There is a chair in the throne room of the Red Keep. It is made of swords, 1,000 blades, according to legend, taken from the enemies of Aegon the Conqueror, melted and twisted into something that is not quite a seat and not quite a sculpture. For 8 seasons of television, that chair sits at the center of every ambition, every betrayal, every war, and every whispered conversation in Game of Thrones. People kill for it. People die for it. People cross oceans and burn cities and sacrifice the people they love most in the world for the right to sit in it. And in the final episode of the series, a dragon melts it. The Iron Throne becomes a puddle of glowing metal on a stone floor, and a man who cannot walk and barely speaks is named the ruler of the 6 kingdoms by a small council of exhausted survivors who do not even bother to vote. That is how it ends. Not with a bang, not with a whimper, but with a shrug. Game of Thrones did not simply have a bad ending. What happened to Game of Thrones in its final season is something rarer and more instructive than that. It is the story of how the most culturally dominant television show of the 21st century destroyed its own legacy in 6 episodes. How a series that had spent 7 years teaching its audience to pay attention, to track details, to trust that every thread would connect, turned around in its final hours and told that audience that none of it mattered. The pacing collapsed. The character arcs folded in on themselves. The themes the show had spent years building were abandoned. Not subverted, but simply dropped, like a juggler who walks off stage while the balls are still in the air. And the result was not just disappointment, it was erasure. Game of Thrones went from being the show everybody talked about to the show nobody rewatches. That is not a small thing. That is a cautionary tale. Welcome to the long night. Get comfortable, settle in, turn the lights down low. This one is going to take a while, and that is the point. We are going to walk through every major failure of Season 8, not to pile on, not to mock, but to understand. Because what went wrong with Game of Thrones is not a mystery. It is not a matter of taste or interpretation. The evidence is right there on the screen, in the scripts, in the interviews, in the choices that were made, and the choices that were not. And if you have not subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these. So consider hitting that button, getting cozy, and letting us walk through this together. Let us get into it. To understand why Season 8 failed, you have to understand the decision that made failure almost inevitable. And that decision was not about a plot twist or a character choice. It was about a number. Specifically, it was about the number 6. Game of Thrones premiered on HBO on April 17, 2011. For its first 6 seasons, the show followed a consistent structure. 10 episodes per season, each running approximately 50 to 60 minutes, each season covering roughly one book or one major arc of the sprawling narrative George R.R. Martin had been building since 1996. The pace was deliberate. Characters traveled at the speed of horses and ships. Political machinations unfolded across entire seasons. A betrayal set up in Episode 2 might not pay off until Episode 9. The show trusted its audience to remember, to connect, to wait, and the audience rewarded that trust with a loyalty that bordered on devotion. Then came Season 7 in 2017, which dropped to 7 episodes. And then Season 8 in 2019, which dropped to 6. The final 13 episodes of the series were asked to do the work that, by the show's own established rhythm, would have required 20, maybe more. The showrunners, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, made this choice deliberately. They had said as early as Season 2 that they envisioned the show running for approximately 7 seasons. HBO, by multiple reports, wanted more. The network's executives were not surprised when Benioff and Weiss confirmed the final 2 seasons would be their last, but they were reportedly stunned when the showrunners said those seasons would be shorter. At one point, the showrunners even proposed ending the series with 3 theatrical films rather than a final television season. HBO talked them out of that. But the compression remained. Think about what that means in practical terms. Season 1 had 10 hours to adapt a Game of Thrones. Season 8 had roughly 6 hours. With episodes running longer, the total runtime was closer to 7.5 hours, but the episode count still constrained the storytelling in fundamental ways. 6 episodes means 6 cold opens, 6 climaxes, 6 sets of rising and falling action. The grammar of television storytelling is built on episode structure, and when you cut the episodes, you do not just lose minutes, you lose beats. You lose the quiet moments between characters that make the loud moments land. You lose the space for a character to sit with a decision before acting on it. You lose the breathing room that separates a story that earns its ending from a story that simply arrives at one. D.B. Weiss described the final season's production schedule by saying, and this is essentially a direct paraphrase, that it had crossed out of a television schedule into more of a mid-range movie schedule. He meant this as a boast. Each episode was produced with the budget and ambition of a feature film. The Battle of Winterfell alone took 55 nights to shoot. The destruction of King's Landing required sets of unprecedented scale. The production values of Season 8 are, by any technical measure, extraordinary. The cinematography, the visual effects, the sound design, the costumes, the score by Ramin Djawadi, all of it is world-class. Nobody who worked on the physical production of Season 8 failed at their job. The failure was in the writing. And the writing failed, in large part, because the writers gave themselves an impossible task. They tried to land an 8-season story in the space of a short film trilogy, and the seams tore open everywhere. Consider the sheer volume of narrative threads that needed resolution by the end of Season 8. The war against the White Walkers. Daenerys Targaryen's claim to the Iron Throne and her psychological trajectory. Jon Snow's true parentage, and what it means for both the throne and his identity. Cersei Lannister's grip on power. Jaime Lannister's redemption arc. Tyrion's role as Hand of the Queen. Arya's journey from traumatized child to trained assassin, and what she does with those skills. Sansa's transformation from naive girl to political operator. Bran Stark's role as the three-eyed raven, and what that power actually means. The Brotherhood without banners. The fate of the Hound and his relationship with his brother. Theon Greyjoy's search for redemption. Samwell Tarly and the role of knowledge. Varys and his true loyalties. The political structure of Westeros itself, and whether the wheel can actually be broken. That is not a comprehensive list. That is a partial list. And every single one of those threads needed not just resolution, but earned resolution. The kind that feels like it grew inevitably from everything that came before. In a 10-episode season, some of those threads could have been given full episodes. In a traditional 2-season arc of 20 episodes, they could have been woven together with the care and patience the show had demonstrated for years. In 6 episodes, many of them were simply cut short, resolved in a line of dialogue, dismissed with a glance, or, in some cases, ignored entirely. The result is a season that moves at a pace Game of Thrones had never moved at before, and that its storytelling engine was never designed to handle. Characters who once took entire seasons to travel from one location to another now teleport across the continent between scenes. Political alliances that once required episodes of negotiation are formed or broken in single conversations. Emotional turning points that the show had spent years building toward arrive with the weight of a text message. The show stopped breathing. And when a show stops breathing, the audience can feel it, even if they cannot articulate exactly what changed. They feel the rush. They feel the absence of the quiet. They feel, instinctively, that the story is no longer trusting them. It is hurting them. The irony is that this rush was entirely self-imposed. HBO wanted more episodes. The audience wanted more episodes. The cast, by most accounts, would have continued. The only people who wanted to compress the ending were the 2 people who held the creative reins. And while their reasons were never fully transparent, burnout after nearly a decade of the most demanding production in television history is an understandable factor. The consequences were borne entirely by the story, and, by extension, by the audience that had invested years of attention and emotional energy into that story. Benioff and Weiss chose to sprint the last 2 miles of a marathon, and the story collapsed at the finish line, not because it could not reach the end, but because it got there too fast to land on its feet. There is a version of Game of Thrones Season 8 that works. It is not hard to imagine. It is the version with 10 episodes. The version where Daenerys' descent is given 5 or 6 episodes to breathe instead of 2. The version where Jon's parentage has time to reshape his relationships and his identity. The version where the battle against the dead is not a single episode, but a campaign that stretches across the north. The version where Bran's ascension to the throne is foreshadowed and earned over hours of storytelling, rather than presented as a twist in the final 30 minutes. That version exists in the gaps of what we got. It haunts Season 8 like a ghost, and every problem we are about to discuss, every failed arc, every rushed decision, every moment that lands with a thud instead of a thunderclap, traces back, in one way or another, to the decision to tell a 10-hour story in 6. That is the foundation. The pacing is not one problem among many. It is the problem from which all other problems flow. And now that we understand the container, we can look at what was forced into it, starting with the 2 episodes that almost got it right. There is a strange and bittersweet quality to the first 2 episodes of Season 8. They are, by almost universal agreement, the best episodes of the final season. Some would argue they are the last truly great episodes the show ever produced. And the reason they work is simple. They are the only episodes that move at the pace Game of Thrones was built to move at. They are the only episodes that trust the quiet. The season premiere, titled Winterfell, aired on April 14, 2019. It was directed by David Nutter and written by Dave Hill. It drew nearly 12 million viewers in the United States on its initial broadcast, a number that swelled to over 17 million when delayed viewing was counted. The audience was there. The anticipation was enormous. And the episode, wisely, does not try to match that anticipation with spectacle. Instead, it does something the show had always done best. It puts characters in rooms together and lets them talk. The episode opens with a deliberate echo of the series premiere. A young boy climbs to get a better view as a royal procession arrives at Winterfell. In Season 1, that boy was Bran Stark, and the procession belonged to Robert Baratheon. Now the procession belongs to Daenerys Targaryen, and the echo is not just visual but thematic. The show is announcing that cycles repeat, that power changes hands but the patterns do not. And it is placing Winterfell, the seat of House Stark, back at the center of the story for the first time in years. What follows is an episode of reunions. Jon Snow returns to Winterfell with Daenerys and her armies. He reunites with Bran, who is no longer the boy he left behind, but something else entirely, something distant and unsettling. He reunites with Arya in the Godswood, and the scene is played with a restraint that honors both characters. They do not run to each other. They do not weep. They meet, and there is a pause, and in that pause is all the distance between who they were and who they have become. Jon reunites with Sansa, and the tension between them is immediate. Sansa does not trust Daenerys. She does not say this directly, not yet, but the show communicates it through glances, through the careful politeness that is more dangerous than open hostility in the world of Westeros. The episode also gives us the moment where Jon learns the truth about his parentage. Samwell Tarly tells him, in the crypts beneath Winterfell, that he is not Ned Stark's bastard. He is Aegon Targaryen, the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. The scene is well acted. Kit Harington plays the shock and disbelief with a physicality that grounds it. But even here, in one of the season's stronger moments, the compression is already visible. Jon learns the most identity-shattering information of his life, and the show gives him roughly one scene to process it before the next crisis demands his attention. In an earlier season, this revelation would have been an episode-ending bombshell followed by at least 2 or 3 episodes of Jon grappling with what it means, for his sense of self, for his relationship with Daenerys, for his claim to the throne, for his understanding of the man he called father his entire life. Here it is a plot point to be metabolized and moved past. But Winterfell works despite this compression because the rest of the episode is doing what the show does best. It is placing chess pieces on a board and letting the audience feel the weight of the coming storm. The dead are marching south. The armies of the living are gathering at Winterfell, and every conversation in the episode carries the unspoken knowledge that many of these characters are going to die. That awareness gives even casual interactions a gravity that the show had not quite achieved since the episodes leading up to the Red Wedding. The second episode is even better. A Night of the Seven Kingdoms aired on April 21, 2019. It was directed by David Nutter and written by Brian Cogman, who had been with the show since the beginning and who had a particular gift for character-driven episodes. This is the episode that, for many fans, represents the last time Game of Thrones felt like itself. And the reason is that Cogman understands something fundamental about the show that the final 4 episodes would forget. The show is not about battles. It is not about spectacle. It is about people in rooms, making choices, revealing themselves through what they say and what they do not say, and the way the camera holds on a face a beat longer than expected. The episode takes place entirely at Winterfell, on the eve of the battle against the army of the dead. There is no King's Landing. There is no Cersei. There is no grand strategy or sweeping action. There is just a castle full of people who believe they are going to die tomorrow, and the things they do with their last night alive. Jaime Lannister stands trial before Daenerys for killing her father. Brienne of Tarth vouches for him. Sansa, who has every reason to hate Jaime, listens to Brienne and accepts her judgment. There is a scene by the fire where Tyrion, Jaime, Brienne, Podrick, Tormund, and Davos sit and drink and talk, and the scene goes on for a long time, and it never drags, because every character in that circle carries the weight of their entire arc into the conversation. Tormund tells a ridiculous story about being nursed by a giant, Podrick sings a haunting song, and Jaime knights Brienne. That moment, Jaime tapping his sword on Brienne's shoulders while she kneels, while the firelight catches the tears she is trying not to shed, is one of the finest moments in the entire series. It is the culmination of an arc that began in Season 2, when Brienne was tasked with escorting a mocking, arrogant Jaime back to King's Landing. Over the course of several seasons, these two characters developed a bond built on mutual respect that neither of them fully understood or acknowledged. The knighting is Jaime seeing Brienne completely, seeing her worth, her honor, her years of being denied recognition by a society that could not accept a woman as a knight, and giving her the thing she has always deserved. And Brienne, who has spent her entire life being mocked for wanting this, finally receives it, and the emotion is too large for her to contain, but too private for her to display. Gwendoline Christie's performance in this scene is extraordinary. She does not cry, she does not smile broadly, she just glows, and the show holds on her face, and you can see every year of rejection and perseverance in her expression. This needs to be stated plainly. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is one of the best episodes of Game of Thrones. It is certainly the best episode of Season 8. And the reason it is the best episode of Season 8 is that it is the only episode that feels like it was written for the show Game of Thrones used to be, rather than the show Game of Thrones was about to become. It is an episode about people. The 4 episodes that follow it are episodes about plot, and in the gap between those two approaches lies the entire tragedy of the final season. There is also a moment in this episode that would haunt the rest of the season. Arya Stark seeks out Gendry. They sleep together. The scene is played as a choice, Arya choosing to experience intimacy before what she believes will be her death. It is a character beat, and it works, but it also positions Arya as a character who is active, who makes choices, who takes what she wants. The show is setting something up, and what it sets up is the single most controversial moment of the entire season, which arrives 1 episode later. But that moment, and everything that comes after it, belongs to a different kind of show than the one we are watching in these first 2 episodes. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms ends with the army of the dead arriving at the walls of Winterfell. The living stand on the battlements and look out into the darkness, and the darkness looks back. It is a perfect cliffhanger, one that earns its tension through character investment rather than spectacle. You are afraid for these people because you have just spent an hour remembering why you love them. The show has done the work, the foundation is solid. What comes next tears that foundation apart. The 3rd episode of Season 8 is titled The Long Night. It aired on April 28, 2019. It was directed by Miguel Sapochnik, who had previously directed Hard Home and Battle of the Bastards, 2 of the most acclaimed battle episodes in television history. It was written by David Benioff and D.B. Weiss. It runs approximately 82 minutes, making it the longest episode in the show's history. It drew just over 12 million viewers on its initial broadcast, and it is the episode where, for millions of viewers, the cracks in Season 8 became impossible to ignore. The premise is straightforward. The army of the dead, led by the Night King, attacks Winterfell. The living make their stand. This is the battle that the entire series has been building towards since its opening scene in the pilot, when 3 Rangers of the Night's Watch encounter the White Walkers beyond the wall, and only one survives to tell the tale. For 8 seasons, the show has been telling its audience that the petty wars of men are meaningless compared to the existential threat marching south. The dead do not care who sits on the Iron Throne. The dead do not negotiate. The dead are winter itself, and winter is coming. This phrase, winter is coming, is the motto of House Stark, the words the show chose to define its central family, the promise that has hung over every scene of political intrigue and personal drama since the very beginning. When winter finally arrives at Winterfell, the show needs to deliver on 8 years of promises. The Long Night is where those promises come due. The first thing the audience noticed was that they could not see. This is not an exaggeration or a retrospective criticism inflated by internet discourse. In real time, as the episode aired, social media exploded with complaints that the battle was too dark to follow. Viewers could not distinguish characters from one another. They could not track the geography of the battle. They could not tell who was fighting whom, who was winning, who was dying. The episode was, in the most literal sense, unwatchable for a significant portion of its audience. Fabian Wagner, the cinematographer, responded to these complaints in interviews. He said the darkness was intentional, designed to create a claustrophobic and disorienting experience that mirrored what the characters were feeling. He said the problem was not with the cinematography, but with viewers' television settings and the compression HBO applied to its streaming signal. He suggested that people did not know how to calibrate their screens. This defense is technically plausible. The episode does look significantly better on a properly calibrated display in a dark room, but it misses the point entirely. A television episode that requires optimal viewing conditions to be comprehensible has failed at the most basic level of visual storytelling. The show is not a museum installation. It is a television program that millions of people watched on laptops, on tablets, on televisions of varying quality, in rooms with varying levels of ambient light. The cinematographer's job is to make the story readable under those conditions, not to create an art piece that only works in a screening room. But the darkness, as frustrating as it was, is not the real problem with The Long Night. The real problem is what happens when you can see. The battle plan the living deploy is, by any military standard, insane. The Dothraki cavalry, the most fearsome mounted warriors in the known world, charge directly into the darkness toward an enemy they cannot see, an enemy that includes tens of thousands of reanimated corpses and cannot be killed by conventional weapons. The charge lasts approximately 30 seconds before every single Dothraki light winks out in the dark. They are annihilated. This is meant to be a moment of horror, and visually it is striking, the line of flaming Eruks surging forward and then vanishing one by one into the black. But narratively, it is absurd. No commander with any tactical sense would send light cavalry in a frontal charge against an enemy of this nature. The Dothraki should have been used for flanking maneuvers, for harassment, for exploiting gaps in the enemy line. Instead, they are sacrificed for a visual effect. The infantry deployment is equally baffling. The Unsullied are positioned outside the walls of Winterfell, in front of the trench line that has been prepared as a defensive barrier. Catapults are placed in front of the infantry rather than behind the walls. The entire defensive strategy appears designed to maximize casualties among the living rather than to exploit the one advantage they have, which is the castle itself. Winterfell is a fortress. Its walls are its greatest asset. A defensive battle centered on those walls, with the trench serving as a killing field and the archers and catapults positioned behind stone, would have been the obvious strategy. Instead, the show places its forces in the field as if they are fighting a conventional army rather than an infinite horde of undead that turns every casualty into a new enemy soldier. Now, it is possible to argue that battle tactics in a fantasy show do not matter, that the audience should not be expecting military realism from a story with dragons and ice zombies. But Game of Thrones itself had established the standard. The Battle of the Blackwater in Season 2 featured Tyrion's wildfire trap, a tactical masterstroke that was both dramatically satisfying and strategically sound. The Battle of Castle Black in Season 4 showed a defensive engagement where the tactics matched the situation. Even the Battle of the Bastards in Season 6, for all its cinematic license, gave Jon Snow a strategic plan that fell apart in a believable way, creating organic tension from the gap between the plan and reality. Game of Thrones had taught its audience to expect tactical coherence. The Long Night abandons it without explanation. The battle itself is a relentless, punishing sequence of action. Characters are overwhelmed, the dead breach the walls. The crypts, where the civilians are hiding, are invaded when the Night King raises the dead Starks from their tombs. Dragon battles rage above the clouds. Theon Greyjoy makes a suicidal charge at the Night King in the Godswood and is killed. Jorah Mormont dies defending Daenerys. Lyanna Mormont, the fierce young leader of Bear Island, kills a giant wight before being crushed. Beric Dondarrion dies protecting Arya. Ed Tollett of the Night's Watch falls early in the fighting. These deaths carry varying degrees of emotional weight. Jorah's death is affecting because the show has spent years building his devotion to Daenerys, and Ian Glenn plays the dying moments with a quiet dignity that transcends the chaos around him. Theon's death is the culmination of one of the show's most complex redemption arcs, a man who betrayed the Starks, who was broken and rebuilt, who returns to defend the home he once tried to steal, and who dies looking Bran Stark in the eye and hearing the words he needed to hear. These moments work because the show has done the work to earn them. The investment was made across seasons. But alongside these earned deaths, something else is happening that undermines the entire episode. Main characters are surviving situations that should kill them. Jon Snow is surrounded by wights multiple times and escapes. Samwell Tarly, who is neither a fighter nor in any physical condition for prolonged combat, lies on a pile of corpses weeping and somehow survives the entire battle. Brienne and Jaime are pinned against a wall, with undead climbing over them, and they do not die. Grey Worm holds the line at a choke point that is physically impossible to hold and survives. Over and over, the episode creates moments of apparent mortal danger for major characters and then cuts away, only to reveal them alive in the next shot. This is the death of stakes. Game of Thrones built its reputation on the willingness to kill characters the audience loved. Ned Stark's execution in Season 1, the Red Wedding in Season 3, Oberyn Martell's death in Season 4. These moments were devastating because they told the audience that no one was safe, that the story operated by its own internal logic rather than by the audience's desire for certain characters to survive, that rules applied equally to heroes and villains, to beloved characters and despised ones. The Long Night takes that principle and reverses it. In the battle that should be the most dangerous event in the show's history, the literal apocalypse, the dead against the living, the show's most important characters have plot armor so thick that the danger becomes performative. You stop fearing for them. You stop believing the show will do what it once did without hesitation. The tension drains from the episode like water from a bathtub, and what is left is spectacle without stakes. And if you are finding this analysis interesting so far, a quick subscribe really does go a long way for the channel. And then there is the ending. The Night King enters the Godswood. Theon is dead. Bran sits in his wheelchair, waiting. The Night King reaches for his weapon. The music drops, and Arya Stark leaps from somewhere. The show is not clear on where exactly, and stabs the Night King with the Valyrian steel dagger, the same dagger that was used in the assassination attempt on Bran in Season 1. The Night King shatters. The army of the dead collapses. The war is over. In the moment, this is shocking. It is designed to be shocking. The show has spent the entire episode positioning Jon Snow as the hero who will confront the Night King. It has given Jon multiple scenes of trying to fight his way through the dead to reach the Godswood. The audience expects Jon versus the Night King. What they get is Arya, appearing from nowhere, ending the defining conflict of the series with a single stab. The showrunners later explained this choice. David Benioff said, in the Behind the Episode segment that aired after The Long Night, that they had decided about 3 years earlier that Arya would be the one to kill the Night King. He said they wanted to avoid the expected, that Jon doing it would have felt too predictable. D.B. Weiss cited a moment from Season 3 where Melisandre tells Arya that she sees darkness in her eyes, brown eyes, blue eyes, green eyes, and that Arya will shut many eyes forever. They framed this line, retroactively, as a prophecy pointing to Arya killing the blue-eyed Night King. This justification does not hold up to scrutiny. Melisandre's line in Season 3 was clearly written as a reference to Arya becoming an assassin, not as a prophecy about the Night King. The Night King did not even exist in the books. He was a creation of the show. The idea that a line of dialogue written years before the Night King's death scene was intended as foreshadowing for that specific event is revisionist at best. More importantly, the show had spent years building a different narrative. The Night King's conflict was with the Three-Eyed Raven and with Jon Snow. The Night King was Jon's antagonist. Jon was resurrected from death, in a story that made no narrative sense unless that resurrection was meant to serve a purpose against the dead. The Azor Ahai prophecy, the prince that was promised, the repeated emphasis on Jon as the shield that guards the realms of men, all of it pointed in one direction. And the show swerved away from it, not because the swerve revealed a deeper truth, but because the swerve was surprising. There is a difference between subverting expectations and betraying them. Ned Stark's death subverts expectations because it reveals that the show operates by different rules than the audience assumed. It changes the way you watch everything that comes after. The Red Wedding subverts expectations because it demonstrates that honor and righteousness are not armor in this world, that playing the Game of Thrones by your own rules when everyone else is playing by different rules gets you killed. These subversions work because they deepen the show's themes. They teach you something about the world the show has created. Arya killing the Night King does not deepen anything. It does not reveal a hidden truth about the show's world. It does not change the way you understand the conflict between the living and the dead. It simply replaces the narratively appropriate hero with a different hero for the sake of surprise. And the surprise, once it fades, leaves a hollow space where meaning should be. Jon Snow's entire arc, his time at the Wall, his death and resurrection, his discovery of his true identity, is left without a climactic payoff. He was brought back from death, and the show never gives him a reason. Think about what that means for the story as a whole. Jon Snow's resurrection was the most dramatic narrative event in the show's history up to that point. A major character died, stayed dead for an entire off-season, while the audience debated whether he would return, and then was brought back to life by a priestess who was not sure her magic would work. That resurrection carried an implicit promise. In a show built on consequences, where death is permanent and choices are irrevocable, bringing someone back from death only works if the story needs them alive, for something that only they can do. Otherwise, the resurrection is just a cheat, a way to have the emotional impact of a death without the narrative cost of actually killing a character. By having Arya kill the Night King, the show retroactively empties Jon's resurrection of its narrative purpose. He was not brought back to defeat the great enemy. He was not brought back to fulfill a prophecy. He was brought back because the audience liked him and the show was not done with his story. That is a commercial reason, not a narrative one. And in a show that had always prioritized narrative logic over commercial logic, it felt like a betrayal. There is also the matter of how the Night King's death resolves the show's central thematic tension. For 7 seasons, Game of Thrones told its audience, explicitly and repeatedly, that the political squabbles of the Seven Kingdoms were petty compared to the existential threat beyond the wall. The show's moral compass pointed consistently in one direction. The people who understood the real threat were the heroes, and the people who ignored it to pursue political power were the fools. Jon Snow understood. Everyone who fought for him understood. Cersei, who refused to help, did not understand. The Long Night resolves this existential threat in a single episode. The battle begins at nightfall. The Night King is dead before dawn. The army of the dead, which had been building in numbers and power for 8 seasons, is eliminated in approximately 80 minutes of screen time. And the remaining 3 episodes of the series are about the political squabble for the Iron Throne. The show tells you for 7 years that the throne does not matter, and then it resolves the thing that does matter in one night, and spends the rest of its finale on the thing that does not. The thematic whiplash is staggering. There is a deeper problem with the Night King as a character that Season 8 exposes but does not address. The Night King has no motivation that the show ever articulates. He wants to destroy the world of the living. That is all the audience knows. He wants to kill the Three-Eyed Raven because the Three-Eyed Raven represents the memory of mankind. Bran explains this in A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, in a scene where the War Council discusses strategy, and the explanation is thin. The Night King is death. He wants to erase life. That is his purpose. There is no negotiation. There is no nuance. There is no moment where the Night King's perspective is given even a sliver of complexity. In the books, the others, the literary equivalent of the White Walkers, are shrouded in mystery, and that mystery is part of their power. Martin has hinted at a deeper mythology behind them, a history that stretches back thousands of years and may involve pacts, broken promises, and a relationship with the children of the forest that is far more complex than simple enmity. The show touches on this in Season 6, when Bran's vision reveals that the children of the forest created the Night King by plunging a dragonglass dagger into a man's chest. But this revelation, which should have opened up an entire dimension of the conflict, who was this man? Why did the children create this weapon? What does it mean that the greatest threat to humanity was created by another species as a weapon against humanity, is never explored. The Night King remains a cipher. He walks, he raises the dead, he rides an undead dragon, he reaches for Bran, and then he shatters. A villain with no interiority can work if the story is structured around the human response to an incomprehensible threat. Alien works this way. The xenomorph has no personality, no dialogue, no motivation beyond predation, and it does not need them, because the story is about the humans trapped with it and how they respond to the impossible. But Game of Thrones is not structured this way. The show has spent years positioning the Night King as the ultimate antagonist, the final boss, the enemy that all other enemies are measured against. When that antagonist turns out to be nothing, when his death reveals that there was never anything behind the mask, that the existential threat was just a CGI figure with no interiority and no purpose beyond being a plot obstacle, the entire mythology of the show collapses. The White Walkers were never interesting. They were never deep. They were set dressing for the human drama, and while that might be Martin's intention in the books, he has said repeatedly that the human heart in conflict with itself is the only thing worth writing about. The show failed to make the human drama that followed the Night King's death compelling enough to justify sidelining the supernatural threat. That is the real damage The Long Night inflicts on the series. It is not just a disappointing battle. It is a statement of priorities. The show is telling you that the Night King was never the point. The human drama was always the point. And there is a version of that argument that could work. George R.R. Martin himself has suggested that the political aftermath of defeating the great evil is the part of the story that interests him most. But that version requires the defeat of the great evil to be costly, to change the survivors in fundamental ways, to leave scars that shape the politics to come. The Long Night kills a handful of supporting characters and leaves every major player essentially unchanged. Winterfell is damaged but standing. The armies of the living are reduced but functional. Daenerys still has her remaining dragon, and Jon is unharmed. The war against the dead is not a world-altering cataclysm. It is a speed bump. The aftermath of the Long Night should have been the richest material in the entire season. The living have survived an impossible battle. They have lost friends, soldiers, entire houses. They should be traumatized, exhausted, fundamentally changed by the experience of fighting the literal dead. The political dynamics should be shattered and reformed by the crucible of survival. Instead, the show gives us a feast scene in the next episode and then pivots immediately to the march south against Cersei, as if the defining battle of the age was a sidebar. That is not the behavior of a show that takes its own mythology seriously. That is the behavior of a show in a hurry. The 4th episode of Season 8 is titled The Last of the Starks. It aired on May 5, 2019. It was directed by David Nutter and written by David Benioff and D.B. Weiss. It drew nearly 12 million viewers, and it is the episode where the tonal incoherence of the final season becomes impossible to miss. The episode begins with a funeral. The dead from the Battle of Winterfell are laid on pyres. The survivors grieve. The camera moves across the faces of the living as they look at the bodies of the fallen, and there is genuine weight to these early scenes. Daenerys weeps over Jorah. Sansa places a stark pin on Theon's chest. The show earns these moments because the previous episodes, whatever their flaws, gave us time with these characters. Then the scene shifts to the feast, and the episode begins to fracture. The celebration is raucous, drunken, messy. And in the midst of it, Daenerys sits at the head table and watches Jon Snow being celebrated by the Northerners. He is being toasted, cheered, embraced. She is being ignored. The show frames this as the beginning of her isolation, the first visible crack in her psyche that will lead to the destruction of King's Landing, and the idea is sound. Daenerys, who has spent her entire life being told she is the rightful queen, who has crossed the world to claim her throne, arrives in Westeros and discovers that the people of the North will never love her the way they love Jon. Her lover is also her rival. Her claim to the throne, which she understood as absolute, is suddenly secondary to his. The emotional logic of jealousy, isolation, and fear driving a person toward increasingly extreme actions, that is a compelling character trajectory, but the show does not have time to develop it. Daenerys goes from watching Jon get cheered at a feast to burning a city full of innocent people in the space of 2 episodes. The emotional beats that should bridge that gap, the slow erosion of trust, the incremental hardening, the moments where she almost turns back and then does not, are compressed into a handful of scenes that tell the audience she is becoming unhinged, rather than showing them the transformation happening from the inside. The Last of the Starks also contains one of the most widely mocked moments in the series. During the feast scene, a Starbucks coffee cup is visible on the table in front of Daenerys. It was later digitally removed, but not before screenshots spread across the internet. In isolation, this is a minor production error, the kind that happens on every set, but it became a symbol of something larger. It became, for many viewers, a visual metaphor for the carelessness they felt was infecting the entire season. If nobody caught a modern coffee cup sitting in the middle of a medieval fantasy scene, what else was being missed? What other details were slipping through the cracks? The answer, as the episode continues, is quite a few. Daenerys and her fleet sail south from Winterfell toward Dragonstone. The fleet is ambushed by Euron Greyjoy, who fires scorpion bolts from his ships and kills Rhaegal, Daenerys' second dragon. The scene is meant to be shocking. Instead, it is baffling. Euron's fleet appears from behind a rock formation, and somehow an entire naval fleet is invisible to Daenerys, who is flying hundreds of feet in the air on the back of a dragon. She does not see the ships. She does not see the scorpions. 3 bolts hit Rhaegal in rapid succession, and the dragon falls from the sky and disappears beneath the waves. The precision of the shots, the invisibility of the fleet, the complete absence of any tactical awareness on Daenerys' part, none of it makes sense on a level that the show once demanded of itself. This is the problem with compressed storytelling. Rhaegal's death is clearly meant to serve multiple narrative purposes. It reduces Daenerys' military advantage. It increases her grief and rage. It gives Euron something to do. It raises the threat level of the Scorpions for the Battle of King's Landing to come. But the scene has no time to set up the ambush in a way that feels organic. It has no time to give Daenerys a reason not to see the fleet. It has no time for the kind of careful staging that would make the kill feel earned rather than arbitrary. So the scene cheats. The fleet is invisible because the plot needs it to be invisible. The bolts hit because the plot needs them to hit. And the audience, which has been trained by 7 years of Game of Thrones to demand internal consistency, feels the strings being pulled. The episode also contains the scene where Jon tells Sansa and Arya the truth about his parentage, and the show does not even bother to show them the conversation. It cuts away. This is a revelation that the series has been building toward for its entire run, arguably the central mystery of the show, the secret that Ned Stark took to his grave, and when it finally reaches the characters it will affect most, the show looks away. We do not see Sansa's reaction. We do not see Arya's. We do not see the questions, the disbelief, the reassessment of everything they thought they knew about their family. We are simply told, later, that Sansa told Tyrion, and Tyrion told Varys, and the secret is out. The most important piece of information in the story is handled as a game of telephone. Additionally, The Last of the Starks features the beginning of the end for Jaime Lannister. After the battle, after the feast, after sleeping with Brienne, the consummation of a relationship the show had been building for 6 seasons, Jaime leaves. In the middle of the night, he gets dressed and walks out. Brienne follows him into the courtyard and begs him to stay. She is crying. He tells her that he is hateful, that he has done terrible things for Cersei, and that he is going back to her. Brienne, who knelt before him and received the honor she had dreamed of her entire life, is left standing in the cold, weeping. This scene is devastating, but its devastation is not the kind the show intended. It is not the tragedy of a complex man unable to escape his worst impulses. It is the tragedy of a writing staff unable to commit to their own character development. Jaime Lannister's arc across the series is one of the most celebrated arcs in television history. He begins as a villain, the man who pushed Bran Stark from a tower window, the incestuous lover of his twin sister, the Kingslayer who murdered the king he swore to protect. And then, slowly, across seasons, the show reveals the man beneath the reputation. The bath scene with Brienne in Season 3, where Jaime confesses the truth about why he killed the Mad King, not out of treachery but out of desperate necessity, to save 500,000 people from wildfire, is one of the show's finest moments of character revelation. From that point forward, Jaime's arc is one of gradual redemption. He loses his hand and his arrogance. He gives Brienne a sword and sends her to protect Sansa Stark. He breaks with Cersei in Season 7 and rides north to fight the dead. Every step of this journey carries the same implicit question: can a man who has done terrible things become good? Can the Kingslayer become a true knight? The show answers this question in Season 8 by saying no. Not because the answer is wrong. A story where Jaime cannot escape his addiction to Cersei, where the pull of his worst self is stronger than the pull of his best self, is a valid and even powerful story. But the execution is a betrayal of everything the show built. Jaime does not gradually slide back. He does not struggle visibly with the pull of Cersei against the pull of Brienne. He simply leaves, in a scene that takes less than 2 minutes, and returns to Cersei, and dies with her under a pile of rubble in the penultimate episode. Seasons of development are reversed in a single scene, and the reversal is not tragic. It is not earned. It is simply abrupt. There is a line Jaime delivers in this scene that encapsulates the problem. He says, essentially, that he never cared about the innocent people of King's Landing. That everything he did for Cersei. This directly contradicts the defining moment of his character, the killing of the Mad King to prevent the destruction of King's Landing and the murder of its people. That act is the moral center of Jaime's entire arc. It is the proof that beneath the arrogance and the incest and the villainy, there is a man who, when it mattered most, chose the lives of strangers over his honor, over his oath, over his reputation. For the show to have Jaime dismiss that choice in a throwaway line is not a character revelation, it is a character assassination. Brienne is left to write Jaime's entry in the Book of Brothers in the series finale, filling in the white page with his deeds. She writes about his knighting her. She writes about his fighting at Winterfell. She writes about his dying protecting his queen. It is meant to be a moment of closure, of Brienne honoring the man she loved by preserving the best version of him in history. But the scene lands differently than intended, because the audience knows what Brienne knows, that the man she honored went back to the woman who was destroying the world, and that the honor she gave him did not change him. The page she fills is a fiction, and the show seems to realize this on some level, because it does not give Brienne a single line of dialogue in the scene. She just writes, and the camera holds on her face. If you are still with us, thank you, and if you have not yet, consider subscribing. It makes a real difference. The 5th episode of Season 8 is titled The Bells. It aired on May 12, 2019. It was directed by Miguel Sapochnik and written by David Benioff and D.B. Weiss. It drew over 12 million viewers. On Rotten Tomatoes, it received one of the lowest approval ratings of any episode in the show's history. And it is the episode where Daenerys Targaryen burns King's Landing. This is the moment the season had been building toward. The moment the show needed to get right above all others. And it is the moment that broke the largest number of viewers. Not because the destination was wrong. Many fans and critics, in retrospect, agree that Daenerys becoming the thing she set out to destroy, a tyrant who uses fire and blood to impose her will on the world, is a valid ending for her character. George R.R. Martin reportedly told Benioff and Weiss the broad strokes of his planned ending for the major characters, and Daenerys burning King's Landing is widely believed to be one of the endpoints he provided. The destination may be correct. The journey is where the show fails. Let us walk through what happens. Daenerys has lost 2 of her 3 dragons. She has lost Jorah, her most devoted protector. She has lost Missandei, her closest friend, who was captured by Cersei's forces and executed on the walls of King's Landing in the previous episode, beheaded in front of Daenerys while Cersei watched. She has learned that Jon Snow has a better claim to the throne she has spent her life pursuing. She has been rejected by the Northerners, who celebrate Jon and ignore her. Varys has betrayed her, attempting to undermine her claim and sending ravens revealing Jon's identity to the lords of Westeros. She has had Varys executed for his treason. She has told Jon that if she cannot rule through love, she will rule through fear. On paper, these are the ingredients for a descent into tyranny: loss, isolation, betrayal, the erosion of every support structure that kept her humanity intact. The problem is that all of these ingredients are poured in at once, in the space of roughly 2 episodes. Daenerys goes from a complicated but fundamentally sympathetic character to a mass murderer in a narrative span that would be rushed for a minor character, let alone the co-protagonist of an 8-season series. Think about the pacing of the show's previous character transformations. Jaime's redemption arc unfolded across 5 full seasons. Theon's fall and rebuilding took 6 seasons. Sansa's transformation from naive girl to political mastermind played out across the entire run of the series. The show understood that character change at this scale requires time, requires the audience to see the incremental shifts, requires moments where the character is on the edge and could go either way. Daenerys gets 2 episodes. 2 episodes to go from breaker of chains to butcher of cities. The scene itself is technically impressive. Daenerys rides Drogon through the defenses of King's Landing, destroying the Scorpion-armed fleet, breaching the walls, and burning the Golden Company to ash. Cersei's forces are routed. The Lannister soldiers throw down their swords. The bells of King's Landing begin to ring, the signal of surrender. Daenerys has won. The city is hers. The throne is hers. And then she does not stop. She looks at the Red Keep. The camera holds on her face, and she begins to burn the city. Not the soldiers, not the defenses, the city. The houses, the streets, the people. Men, women, children running through the streets as Dragonfire turns King's Landing into an inferno. The scene goes on for a long time. Sapochnik films it from the ground, following Arya through the destruction, showing the audience the human cost of Daenerys' choice at street level. It is harrowing, it is visceral, it is, from a pure filmmaking perspective, one of the most powerful sequences the show ever produced. But it does not work, because the show has not earned it. The audience needed to see Daenerys struggle. They needed to see her cross small moral lines before crossing the largest one. They needed to see the kindness drain from her gradually, scene by scene, decision by decision, until the woman who once locked her dragons in a pyramid because they killed one child becomes the woman who burns a city full of children. They needed to see her justify it to herself. They needed to see the internal logic of her madness, the way it makes sense from inside, even as it looks insane from outside. They needed what the show always gave its best characters: interiority expressed through behavior, the slow accumulation of choices that turns a person into something they never imagined becoming. Instead, the show gives us a montage of losses in episodes 4 and 5, and then a single scene where Daenerys stares at the Red Keep and makes a choice that contradicts everything the audience has watched her do for 7 seasons. The show tells us this was foreshadowed. It points to Daenerys' moments of cruelty, crucifying the Masters in Meereen, burning the Tarleys alive. And there is truth to the idea that Daenerys always had a capacity for violence. But capacity is not the same as inevitability. Every character in Game of Thrones has a capacity for violence. What separates a compelling character trajectory from a jarring plot twist is the work the show does to make the progression feel inevitable in retrospect. Daenerys' turn does not feel inevitable. It feels like a switch being flipped. The argument that foreshadowing is not the same as character development was articulated by many critics during the peak of the backlash. It is a crucial distinction. Pointing to moments of cruelty scattered across 7 seasons does not constitute a coherent arc of descent. An arc requires progression. It requires each step to follow from the last. Daenerys crucifying slave masters who crucified children is not the same kind of cruelty as burning innocent civilians who have surrendered. There is a moral gap between those actions that the show needed to bridge, and it never did. There is also the question of what the show is saying. Thematically, by having Daenerys destroy King's Landing. For years, the show positioned Daenerys as a liberator. She freed the slaves of Slaver's Bay. She broke the chains of the Unsullied. She was called Misa, Mother, by the people she freed. And then, in her final act, she becomes the greatest mass murderer in the history of Westeros. The thematic implication is clear. The liberator was always a tyrant in waiting. The savior was always a destroyer. The idealist was always a monster. Power corrupts, and Daenerys was always going to be corrupted. This is a valid theme. It is, in many ways, the central theme of the entire series. But the way the show executes it carries a troubling subtext that many critics noted. The Rotten Tomatoes critical consensus for Season 8 specifically stated that the season shortchanges the women of Westeros, sacrificing satisfying character arcs for spectacular set pieces. Daenerys' arc is the most prominent example. The show takes its most powerful female character and, in the space of 2 episodes, turns her into a figure driven to madness by jealousy and isolation. The speed of the transformation means the show cannot show the internal logic of her choices, which means the audience is left with an external reading that reduces one of television's most complex female characters to a stereotype. She went crazy. She snapped. The Targaryen madness got her. These are not analyses of a nuanced character arc. They are dismissals made possible by the show's failure to do the work. Cersei Lannister dies in this episode as well, and her death is another casualty of the season's compression. Cersei has been one of the show's greatest characters, a woman of fierce intelligence and boundless cruelty, a mother whose love for her children is the one genuine emotion in a life otherwise governed by ambition and resentment. Lena Headey's performance across 8 seasons is one of the anchoring achievements of the entire series. And Cersei's death is standing in a basement with Jaime while rocks fall on them. The show denies Cersei an ending worthy of her complexity. She does not scheme, she does not fight, she does not make a final, characteristic choice that reveals who she truly is. She stands on a balcony and watches her city burn, and then she goes to the basement with the man she loves, and the ceiling collapses. Her last words are that she does not want to die, that she wants their baby to live. It is a human moment, and Headey plays it beautifully. But it is not a Cersei moment. The woman who blew up the Great Sept of Baelor with wildfire, who outmaneuvered Tyrion and Margaery and the High Sparrow, who stared down threats from every direction and survived through sheer force of will, that woman deserved an ending that engaged with her intelligence, her ruthlessness, her capacity for both cruelty and love. Instead, she gets rubble. The Bells is the episode that broke the fandom. It is not the worst reviewed episode, that distinction belongs to the finale, but it is the episode where the largest number of viewers went from worried to angry. A petition on change.org demanding that HBO remake Season 8 with competent writers was already circulating, but it exploded after The Bells, eventually gathering more than 1.8 million signatures. The petition was, of course, performative. No one expected HBO to actually remake the season, but the scale of it communicated something real. This was not a vocal minority of internet trolls. This was a mass audience saying, clearly and loudly, that the show they had loved for the better part of a decade had failed them. Let us pause here and talk about what happened to Jon Snow across this season, because his arc is arguably the single greatest waste of potential in the entire final run. Jon Snow is, by any reasonable reading of the series, the protagonist of Game of Thrones. He is not the only protagonist. The show is an ensemble, and characters like Daenerys, Tyrion, and Cersei share the narrative spotlight, but he is the character around whom the show's central mysteries revolve. His parentage, his resurrection, his role in the war against the dead, his claim to the Iron Throne. For 8 seasons, the audience has been told, implicitly and explicitly, that Jon Snow matters, that his story is going somewhere, that the accumulation of trauma and sacrifice and discovery will lead to a destination that justifies the journey. Season 8 gives Jon nothing to do. This needs to be stated in the bluntest possible terms, because the scope of the failure is difficult to articulate with nuance. Jon Snow, the resurrected king, the secret Targaryen, the man who united the living against the dead, spends the final season of the show standing in rooms while other people make decisions. He does not kill the Night King. He does not claim the throne. He does not use his Targaryen heritage in any meaningful way. He does not ride a dragon into battle with purpose or agency. He rides Rhaegal in the 1st and 3rd episodes, but neither ride results in a moment that is specifically Jon's, a moment that could not belong to any other character. His discovery of his parentage, which should be the axis around which the final season turns, leads to exactly one narrative consequence. It makes Daenerys jealous. That is it. Jon learns that he is Aegon Targaryen, the true-born son of Rhaegar and Lyanna, the heir to the Iron Throne, and the only thing this information does is fuel Daenerys' paranoia and drive a wedge between them. Jon never wrestles with the identity crisis this revelation should provoke. He never questions what it means to be a Stark and a Targaryen. He never confronts the implications of his parents' relationship. Rhaegar started a war that killed thousands of people, and whether Lyanna went willingly or was taken is a question that shaped the political landscape of Westeros for a generation. Jon never sits with any of this. He is told, and he is sad, and he moves on. The show had the opportunity to make Jon's parentage the most profound character crisis in its history. Imagine a version of Season 8 where Jon spends multiple episodes processing what he has learned, where he visits the crypts and looks at Lyanna's statue and tries to reconcile the mother he never knew with the father he always believed in, where he talks to Bran about Rhaegar and asks questions the audience has been asking for years, where he struggles with the political implications. Does he want the throne? Does he believe he should have it? What does it mean to have a better claim than the woman he loves? Where his Targaryen blood creates a genuine internal conflict between his Stark upbringing and his genetic inheritance. Where the revelation changes his relationships with Sansa, with Arya, with Daenerys, with everyone around him, in specific, dramatized ways that the audience can watch unfold. None of this happens. Jon tells Sansa and Arya off-screen. He tells Daenerys that he does not want the throne, and she does not believe him, and that is the extent of the dramatic exploration. The secret that Ned Stark died to protect, the secret that Bran traveled beyond the wall and became the three-eyed raven to uncover, the secret that the show teased and hinted and built toward for its entire run, changes nothing about the story except to give Daenerys a reason to be afraid. Kit Harington, in interviews after the finale, was candid about his feelings. He said the petition to remake the season genuinely angered him, calling it a level of idiocy that could only come about through social media. But he also acknowledged that the final season was an enormous challenge, and that not every choice landed as intended. His performance in the final season is committed and physically present. There is a scene in The Bells where Jon walks through the streets of King's Landing as Daenerys burns it, and the horror on his face is genuine and devastating. But the writing gives him nothing to do with that horror except stare. Jon Snow, in the final season, is a witness. He watches the Night King die. He watches Daenerys destroy King's Landing. He watches the political aftermath unfold. And then he acts, once, in the finale, by killing Daenerys. That single act of agency in the final episode is his only meaningful contribution to the resolution of the story. There is a version of this ending where Jon killing Daenerys is the most devastating moment in television history. A man who loves a woman, killing her to save the world, knowing that the act will destroy him. The Azor Ahai prophecy fulfilled in the cruelest possible way, not as a triumphant hero forging a magical sword, but as a broken man plunging a dagger into the heart of the person he loves because there is no other choice. If the show had built to this moment with the care it built toward the Red Wedding or Ned's execution, it could have been transcendent. Instead, it is a scene that happens, is briefly mourned, and is immediately superseded by the question of who will rule Westeros. The sixth and final episode of the series is titled The Iron Throne. It aired on May 19, 2019. It was directed by David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, the only episode of the series they both directed, and written by Benioff and Weiss. It drew over 13.5 million viewers, the largest audience in the show's history. On Rotten Tomatoes, it holds one of the lowest approval ratings of the entire series. And it is the episode that answers the question the show has been asking since its first scene: who will rule Westeros? The answer is Bran Stark. And the way the show arrives at that answer is perhaps the most deflating sequence in the history of prestige television. Jon Snow kills Daenerys. He kisses her, and then stabs her with a dagger in the throne room, beside the Iron Throne itself. Drogon melts the throne, an act of symbolic fury that is visually striking, but narratively confusing, since the show gives no clear indication that Drogon understands the throne's symbolic significance. Drogon takes Daenerys' body and flies east, and the show never tells us where he goes. Jon is imprisoned by Grey Worm and the Unsullied. Then the show jumps forward in time. Weeks pass. The lords and ladies of Westeros gather in the Dragon Pit to decide the fate of the realm and the fate of Jon Snow. This scene is meant to be the culmination of the entire series. It is meant to answer the question of what comes after the Game of Thrones, of whether the wheel can be broken, of what kind of governance Westeros will have now that every would-be monarch is dead or deposed. Tyrion, who is a prisoner but is somehow allowed to give a lengthy speech to the assembled lords, proposes that instead of a hereditary monarchy, the ruler of Westeros should be chosen by the lords and ladies of the great houses. And he nominates Bran Stark, the three-eyed raven, on the grounds that Bran has the best story. This is the line that, more than any other single moment in the finale, crystallized the audience's frustration. Tyrion says, essentially, that there is nothing in the world more powerful than a good story, and that no one has a better story than Bran the Broken. The assembled lords agree. Bran becomes king. The problem is not that Bran becoming king is inherently wrong. George R.R. Martin has confirmed, or at least strongly implied, that Bran's coronation is one of the endpoints he provided to the showrunners. In the books, where Bran's arc is richer and more developed, where his connection to the old gods and the Weirwood network carries deeper mythological weight, there is a version of this ending that could be profound. A crippled boy who fell from a tower and spent years becoming something more than human, ascending to a throne not through violence or ambition, but through knowledge and vision. That is a story with thematic resonance. But the show did not tell that story. The show barely included Bran in Season 5. It brought him back in Season 6 as the Three-Eyed Raven, but never clearly explained what that meant, or what Bran's powers were actually for. In Season 7, Bran is strange and detached, delivering cryptic statements, and sitting in his wheelchair staring at nothing. In Season 8, Bran does even less. He sits in the Godswood during the Battle of Winterfell, warging into ravens for no discernible purpose. He offers no strategic insight. He takes no meaningful action. He tells Tyrion his story off-screen, in a scene the show deliberately does not show the audience. And then Tyrion tells us that this story is the best story anyone has. The audience's response was immediate and overwhelming. Who has a better story than Bran the Broken? The answer, from the audience's perspective, was virtually everyone. Arya, who traveled to Braavos and became a faceless man and killed the Night King. Jon Snow, who died and was resurrected and learned he was the heir to the throne. Sansa, who survived Joffrey and Ramsay and emerged as the political master of the North. Daenerys, who rose from nothing to conquer half the world. Even Tyrion himself, the dwarf who was despised by his own family and fought his way to the position of Hand of the Queen. All of these characters have richer, more dramatic, more compelling stories than Bran, who spent the better part of 3 seasons sitting in a chair being inscrutable. The show had an opportunity to make this work. In A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, the second episode, there is a scene where Bran and Tyrion sit together, and Bran begins to tell Tyrion his story. The camera cuts away. We do not hear what Bran says. This is the scene that should have justified the entire ending. If the audience had been present for that conversation, if they had heard Bran describe his journey, the fall, the visions, the three-eyed raven, the children of the forest, the history of Westeros stretching back thousands of years, they would have understood what Tyrion understood. They would have seen why this particular story carries a weight that no other character's story does. They would have had the evidence they needed to accept the ending on its own terms. Instead, the show cuts away from the one scene that could save its ending. It denies the audience the information they need to accept the conclusion. And then, in the finale, it asks them to accept that conclusion based on a line of dialogue that summarizes a conversation they were never allowed to hear. This is not subversive storytelling. This is not trusting the audience. This is withholding the evidence and then asking for the verdict. It is, to put it plainly, a storytelling failure so fundamental that it is difficult to understand how it survived the script stage, let alone the editing room. The irony is almost too perfect. Tyrion says that nothing is more powerful than a good story, and the show fails, in its final act, because it does not tell the story well enough. The ending of Game of Thrones is a story about the power of stories that forgets to be a good story itself. The show seems to understand this on some level, because it surrounds Bran's coronation with endings for the other characters that feel like consolation prizes. Jon is sent back to the Wall, to the Night's Watch, which no longer has a purpose since the White Walkers are gone, and the wildlings are at peace. He walks beyond the Wall with the free folk, and the show frames this as a kind of freedom, a return to the wild where Jon always felt most at home. And there is a reading of this ending that works. Jon has always been most himself beyond the Wall, among the people who judged him by his actions rather than his birth. But the reading is undermined by the fact that the show spent its final season revealing that Jon is the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, and then did absolutely nothing with that information. Jon's Targaryen heritage, the biggest reveal in the series, changes nothing about his ultimate fate. He ends exactly where he started, at the Wall, heading north. Sansa becomes queen in the north, which is the most satisfying of the Stark endings, but raises its own questions. If the North can simply declare independence, why can every other kingdom not do the same? Yara Greyjoy, who was promised independence for the Iron Islands by Daenerys, says nothing. The Prince of Dorne, a new character the audience has never seen before, says nothing. The show hand-waves the geopolitical implications of Sansa's secession because it does not have time to deal with them. Arya sails west of Westeros, to whatever lies beyond the known maps. This is framed as an adventure, and Maisie Williams plays it with an appealing mixture of excitement and determination. But it also feels like the show running out of ideas for what to do with a character it made too powerful. Arya can kill anyone. She killed the Night King. She survived the destruction of King's Landing. What do you do with a character who has transcended all obstacles? You send her off the map, literally, and hope the audience reads it as a new beginning, rather than an admission that the story does not know what to do with her. Tyrion becomes Hand of the King again, serving under Bran. The small council assembles. Bronn is Master of Coin, which is played as a joke despite the fact that Bronn is an illiterate sellsword with no financial knowledge. Sam is Grand Maester, despite not having completed his training. Davos is Master of Ships. Brienne is Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. The scene is played for warmth and humor, and it works on that superficial level, but it also feels weightless. These appointments are fan service dressed as governance. They reward audience favorites rather than following the logic of the world. Settling in comfortably? Good. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a wonderful time. The final image of the series is Jon Snow walking beyond the Wall with the free folk, the gate closing behind him, the trees stretching out ahead. It is a beautiful shot. The music swells. The credits roll, and the audience is left with the question that has defined the discourse around Game of Thrones ever since. Was that it? There is a specific kind of failure that belongs to Game of Thrones Season 8, and to no other show. It is not the failure of a bad show being bad. It is the failure of a great show becoming mediocre in the exact moments where it needed to be transcendent. The early seasons of Game of Thrones, seasons 1 through 4 by most reckonings, with 5 and 6 being more uneven but still capable of extraordinary moments, built something that had never existed before on television. A fantasy epic that was taken seriously by people who did not take fantasy seriously. A show that combined the political intrigue of a John le Carré novel with the scope and spectacle of a Peter Jackson film. A show where every death mattered, every choice had consequences, and every episode rewarded close attention. The show was based on A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, and for its first 4 seasons, it had a nearly complete text to adapt. The first season adapted A Game of Thrones. The second adapted A Clash of Kings. The third and fourth adapted A Storm of Swords, Martin's masterpiece, the book that contained the Red Wedding and the Purple Wedding, and the trial of Tyrion Lannister, and the duel between Oberyn Martell and the Mountain. These seasons are extraordinary television because they are built on an extraordinary foundation. Martin's plotting is meticulous. His characters are psychologically real. His world is detailed enough to reward any level of scrutiny. The show's writers, Benioff and Weiss chief among them, but also Brian Cogman, Dave Hill, Vanessa Taylor, and others, translated that material to the screen with skill and intelligence, making changes where necessary, but preserving the essential architecture. The trouble began when the show outpaced the books. A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, Martin's fourth and fifth novels, were partially adapted in seasons 5 and 6, but the show was already moving beyond the published material. Martin had not finished The Winds of Winter, the sixth book, and as of the time this video is being made, he still has not. The show was flying blind. This is where the distinction between adaptation and original storytelling becomes critical. Benioff and Weiss are skilled adapters. They demonstrated this across 4 seasons of television that are among the best ever produced. But adapting a text and creating one from scratch are different skills. Adapting requires an eye for what works on screen, a sense of pacing, and the ability to cut without losing the heart of the story. Original creation requires a different kind of imagination, the ability to build architecture from nothing, to see where a character needs to go, and then construct the path that takes them there, step by organic step. Martin is a genius at this. He builds his stories from character outward, letting the plot emerge from the choices real people would make in the situations he creates. The show's later seasons, without Martin's roadmap, defaulted to a different approach, plotting from destination backward, deciding where characters needed to end up, and then constructing the shortest possible path to get them there. This is why so many of the show's late-season character choices feel like reversals rather than developments. The writers knew where the characters needed to end up. Martin told them the endpoints, but they did not have Martin's 1,000 pages of internal logic showing how those characters got there, so they skipped the journey. They jumped from point A to point Z and asked the audience to fill in the gaps. And when the gaps are small, the audience can do that. When the gaps are chasms, Daenerys going from liberator to mass murderer in 2 episodes, Jaime going from Brienne's knight to Cersei's lover in 1 scene, Bran going from background presence to King of Westeros in 1 speech, the audience cannot bridge them. The story breaks. This needs to be stated plainly. The failure of Season 8 is not primarily a failure of acting. The cast is extraordinary across the board. Emilia Clarke does everything humanly possible with the material she is given, finding moments of vulnerability and rage and grief in scenes that give her very little to work with. Nikolaj Coster-Waldau brings a wounded dignity to Jaime's final episodes that the writing does not deserve. Peter Dinklage, who won 4 Emmy Awards for his portrayal of Tyrion, performs his final season speeches with the conviction of a man who believes in every word, even when the words themselves ring hollow. Lena Headey, given almost nothing to do in the final season, makes every one of her limited scenes count through sheer force of presence. The actors did not fail the show. The show failed the actors. The failure is not primarily one of direction. Miguel Sapochnik's work on The Long Night and the Bells is visually stunning. David Nutter brings a steady, elegant hand to the quieter episodes. The direction across Season 8 is technically accomplished, often brilliant. The problem is that brilliant direction cannot compensate for writing that does not give the scenes room to breathe. The failure is not one of production. Season 8 cost a reported $15 million per episode, making it the most expensive season of television ever produced at that time. The sets are extraordinary. The visual effects won Emmy Awards. The costumes by Mikel Clapton are immaculate. Ramin Djawadi's score, particularly the track The Night King that plays during the climax of The Long Night, is among the finest pieces of music ever composed for television. Every department delivered at the highest level. The failure is in the writing, and the failure in the writing traces back to 2 decisions. The decision to compress the final seasons, and the decision not to bring in additional writers who could help bear the creative burden. Brian Cogman, the show's most consistent non-showrunner writer, wrote only 1 episode of Season 8, A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, which is, not coincidentally, the best episode of the season. Dave Hill wrote the premiere. Every other episode was written by Benioff and Weiss. For a season carrying this much narrative weight, 4 scripts from 2 writers is a remarkable concentration of creative authority. And it shows. The Tyrion Lannister of the final seasons is a case study in how the writing declined. In the first 4 seasons, Tyrion is the show's most dynamic and verbally dexterous character. His dialogue crackles with intelligence, with wit, with the specific rhythms of a man who has survived by being smarter than everyone around him. Peter Dinklage won his first Emmy for the show's first season, and the writing gave him material worthy of his talent. Tyrion's trial speech in Season 4 is one of the greatest monologues in television history, a raw, furious, soul-bearing condemnation of the world that hated him from birth. In the later seasons, Tyrion becomes a different character. His plans fail, repeatedly and inexplicably. He advises Daenerys to take the patient, merciful approach in her conquest of Westeros, and his strategies are outmaneuvered at every turn by Cersei. His intelligence, once the show's greatest asset, becomes a liability, and his dialogue, once sharp and surprising, devolves into earnest speeches about the importance of stories and the power of a good heart. The man who once said that he wished he was the monster they thought he was, the man who killed his own father on the privy, becomes the show's moral conscience, a role that requires him to be sincere and hopeful in a way that flattens every interesting edge of his character. In the finale, Tyrion gives the speech that decides the fate of Westeros. He tells the assembled lords that stories are the most powerful thing in the world. He nominates Bran. The lords agree, and the audience sits there thinking that the smartest character on television just made the least convincing argument ever presented in a council scene that the show once excelled at writing. Think about the council scenes in earlier seasons, the small council meetings where Cersei and Tyrion and Varys and Littlefinger sparred with each other, where every line of dialogue carried multiple meanings, where alliances shifted with a raised eyebrow. Think about the trial of Tyrion, where the legal and political machinery of Westeros was laid bare in all its corrupt glory. Think about Littlefinger explaining the concept of chaos as a ladder, or Varys telling the riddle of the Three Kings. These scenes worked because the dialogue was doing multiple things at once, advancing the plot, revealing character, building the world, entertaining the audience. The council scene in the finale does one thing. It delivers the endpoint. Bran is king. The scene is a delivery mechanism for a predetermined conclusion, and the dialogue exists only to get there. There is something almost cruel about the gap between the quality of the performance and the quality of the material in Season 8. Peter Dinklage, in the finale, delivers a monologue about finding Jaime and Cersei in the rubble that should be one of the great dramatic moments of the series. He talks about his siblings, about the complicated, toxic, inescapable bond between them, about the fact that despite everything Cersei did, she was still his sister. Dinklage plays it with a rawness that transcends the script. His voice breaks in the right places. His eyes are wet but not weeping. He finds the exact register between grief and exhaustion that makes the moment feel lived in rather than performed. And then the scene pivots to Tyrion arguing that Bran should be king, and the spell breaks, and you are watching a great actor servicing a script that does not deserve him. The same can be said of Emilia Clarke, who received an Emmy nomination for her final season performance. Clarke had spent years being underrated by critics who mistook the character's composure for a lack of range. In Season 8, she demonstrates range that should have silenced every doubter. The scene where she learns of Jorah's death, the way her face slowly collapses, the way she touches his body with a tenderness that makes the battlefield disappear, is extraordinary. The scene at the feast in Episode 4, where she watches Jon being celebrated, and you can see the loneliness and the jealousy, and the dawning realization of her isolation playing across her features in real time, that is acting of the highest order. Clarke does everything the script asks and more. She finds humanity in a turn that the writing has not earned, and if the transformation of Daenerys Targaryen has any emotional impact at all, it is because of Clarke, not because of the script. Ramin Djawadi's score for the final season deserves its own discussion. Djawadi had been composing for the show since its first episode, and his work had grown in ambition and emotional depth with each season. The Light of the Seven, his piano-driven composition for the destruction of the Great Sept of Baelor in Season 6, was a landmark moment in television scoring, the introduction of a new instrument into the show's musical vocabulary to signal that something unprecedented was about to happen. In Season 8, Djawadi produces what may be his finest work for the series, The Night King, the piece that accompanies Theon's last stand and the Night King's approach to Bran in the Godswood, is a masterpiece of sustained tension. It builds and builds, piano notes ascending with an inevitability that mirrors the approach of the Night King himself, until the moment breaks, and Arya leaps, and the music shatters into silence. Djawadi gives the scene a grandeur and an emotional weight that the writing alone could not provide. The score for the destruction of King's Landing is equally remarkable. As Daenerys burns the city, Djawadi layers choral voices over the crumbling architecture, creating a sound that is at once beautiful and horrifying. The music does not tell you how to feel. It creates a space where multiple feelings can coexist: awe at the spectacle, horror at the human cost, grief for the character who has become this. In a lesser show, the music would be supplemental. In Season 8, it is often doing the work the writing should be doing. Djawadi's score is the emotional glue that holds scenes together when the narrative logic fails. It is the connective tissue between moments that the script has left disconnected, and it is a testament to his genius that the Season 8 soundtrack is one of the most acclaimed albums in the show's history, even as the season it accompanies is the most reviled. The same could be said of the costume design by Mikel Clapton, the production design by Deborah Riley, and the work of hundreds of craftspeople who poured years of their lives into making the final season look and sound and feel like the most expensive television ever produced. Because it was. And on a technical level, it delivered. The problem was never the craft. The problem was never the resources. The problem was never the talent, either in front of the camera or behind it. The problem was always and only the writing. And that is what makes the failure of Season 8 so specific and so instructive. It is proof that no amount of money, no amount of talent, no amount of technical excellence can compensate for a story that does not work. The story is the foundation. When the foundation cracks, everything built on top of it, no matter how beautiful, settles and shifts and eventually falls. The decline of Tyrion's character is mirrored by the decline of every character who relies on intelligence rather than action. Varys, the spider, the master of whispers, whose intelligence network once stretched across 2 continents, becomes a man who openly discusses treason at the dinner table and is caught and executed for his trouble. Littlefinger, who was arguably the most intelligent character in the entire show, was dispatched in Season 7 in a scene that required him to be inexplicably stupid so that the Stark sisters could have their moment of triumph. Cersei, whose cunning kept her alive through a decade of threats, spends the final season standing on a balcony drinking wine and watching things happen. The show's engagement with intelligence, with the complexity of politics and the subtlety of power, was always its greatest distinction from other fantasy properties. Lord of the Rings is about the triumph of good over evil. Game of Thrones was about the fact that good and evil are not useful categories in a world where everyone believes they are the hero of their own story. That moral complexity required intelligent characters making intelligent choices in a world that rewarded intelligence. When the writing stopped being able to produce that intelligence, when the writers no longer had Martin's text to draw from and could not replicate his gift for political and psychological complexity, the show's most distinctive quality evaporated. Let us talk about what happened to the Prophecies. Game of Thrones, like the books it was based on, is rich with prophecy. The prince that was promised. Azor Ahai reborn. The stallion who mounts the world. Cersei's prophecy from Maggie the Frog. The Valonqar. The Lord of Light's purpose for his chosen. These prophecies were woven into the fabric of the show's mythology. They gave the audience a framework for speculation. They suggested that beneath the chaos of the plot, there was a deeper pattern, a metaphysical structure that would ultimately give meaning to the suffering and the sacrifice. Season 8 abandons the prophecies almost entirely. The prince that was promised is never identified. Azor Ahai is never reborn, unless you argue, as some have, that Jon plunging a blade into Daenerys' heart is a dark fulfillment of the prophecy, but the show makes no effort to draw that connection. The Valonqar prophecy, which in the books predicts that Cersei will be killed by a younger sibling, was cut from the show's adaptation entirely, but its shadow lingered in the audience's expectations. The Lord of Light brings characters back from the dead and then is never mentioned again after the Battle of Winterfell, as if an entire religion with demonstrated supernatural power simply stopped existing because the plot no longer needed it. This abandonment of prophecy is particularly damaging because Game of Thrones spent years training its audience to look for patterns. The show rewarded attentive viewers. It planted seeds in early seasons that paid off years later. Hodor's name, Lyanna's Tower of Joy, the significance of Valyrian steel. The audience learned to trust that the show was working on a level beneath the surface, that every detail might be meaningful, that patience would be rewarded with revelations that recontextualized everything that came before. When the final season arrives and the prophecies are simply ignored, not subverted in interesting ways, not revealed to have different meanings than expected, but simply dropped, the message to the audience is clear. The patterns were never real. The details did not matter. You were paying closer attention than the show deserved. Your company on this journey means a lot. If the channel has earned your trust tonight, subscribing is the kindest thing you can do. There is a conversation that happened outside the show that shaped everything about Season 8, and it deserves examination. In 2018, it was announced that David Benioff and D.B. Weiss had been hired to create a new series of Star Wars films. The deal was announced before Season 8 had finished production. The timing invited a narrative that has proven difficult to dislodge, that Benioff and Weiss rushed the ending of Game of Thrones because they were eager to move on to Star Wars. This narrative is not entirely fair. The showrunners had been discussing a compressed final season since before the Star Wars deal was announced. Their desire to end the show in 7 or 8 seasons predates any known discussions with Lucasfilm. And the creative and personal toll of running the most demanding production in television for nearly a decade should not be underestimated. By Season 8, Benioff and Weiss had been working on Game of Thrones for more than 10 years, including development. Burnout is a real phenomenon, and its effects on creative output are well documented. But the perception matters. The audience saw a show that felt rushed, and they saw the showrunners signing a deal with another franchise before the current one was finished. The conclusion was inevitable. They checked out early. They were already thinking about their next project. They gave us the minimum viable ending instead of the ending the show deserved. Whether this perception is accurate is impossible to know from the outside, but it colored the reception of every creative decision in the final season. Every shortcut, every compressed arc, every moment that felt unearned was filtered through the audience's belief that the people in charge had one foot out the door. For what it is worth, Benioff and Weiss left the Star Wars project in 2019. They moved to Netflix, where they went on to produce the adaptation of Three Body Problem. And when they finally addressed the backlash to Season 8 in interviews years later, their responses were measured but telling. Benioff said he always hoped everyone would love the ending, but acknowledged they did not. Weiss was even more circumspect, suggesting that the intensity of the reaction was, in part, a testament to how deeply people cared about the show. Neither showrunner has ever said they would do anything differently. Neither has acknowledged that the compressed episode count was a mistake. Neither has addressed the specific criticisms about pacing, character development, or the handling of individual arcs. There are smaller character moments in Season 8 that work, and they deserve acknowledgement, because they demonstrate what the season could have been if it had been given the space to breathe. The Hound's arc, for all the problems surrounding it, reaches a conclusion in the bells that carries genuine weight. Sandor Clegane has been defined by 2 things for the entire series: his hatred of his brother Gregor and his fear of fire. In the bells, he climbs the stairs of the Red Keep to face his brother one last time. The long-anticipated Clegane Bowl that the internet had been demanding for years. The fight itself is brutal and operatic. Gregor, now an undead monstrosity beneath his armor, is nearly impossible to kill. He crushes a man's skull. He shrugs off wounds that would kill any living person. And the Hound, who has feared fire his entire life, makes a choice. He tackles his brother through a wall, and they fall together into the inferno below. The man who was scarred by fire as a child chooses fire as his weapon and his grave. This is a good ending for the Hound. It is not a great ending. The execution is somewhat rushed, and the scene has to compete for screen time with the destruction of King's Landing happening simultaneously. But the emotional logic tracks. The Hound has been walking toward this confrontation for 8 seasons, and when it arrives, his choice to embrace the thing he fears most in order to destroy the thing he hates most is consistent with his character's journey from nihilistic survivor to someone who, in his own brutal way, cares. Similarly, Theon Greyjoy's death in The Long Night is one of the season's genuine successes. Theon's arc across the series is astonishing in its scope. He begins as a ward of House Stark, insecure and desperate for approval. He betrays the Starks and seizes Winterfell. He is captured by Ramsay Bolton and tortured into becoming Reek, a creature so broken that he cannot remember his own name. And then, slowly, across seasons, he rebuilds himself. He rescues Sansa. He returns to the Iron Islands. He fights at Winterfell. And in his final moments, he charges the Night King in the Godswood, knowing he will die, and Bran tells him he is a good man. The look on Alfie Allen's face when he hears those words, the relief, the gratitude, the peace of a man who has spent his entire life wondering if he could ever be forgiven, is one of the finest moments of acting in the entire series. Theon's death works because the show earned it across 7 seasons of careful character development. It is proof that when the show gives itself time, when it invests in the incremental steps of a character's transformation, the payoff is immense. The tragedy is that Theon's arc is the exception in Season 8 rather than the rule. Most characters are not given this quality of resolution. Most characters are given a shortcut, a summary, a gesture toward an ending rather than an ending itself. There is one more aspect of the Season 8 production that deserves discussion, and that is the phenomenon of inside the episode. After each episode of the final season aired, HBO broadcast a behind-the-scenes segment in which Benioff and Weiss explained their creative decisions. These segments had been a standard feature throughout the show's run, but in Season 8, they became a focal point of audience frustration. The showrunners' explanations often seemed to contradict what was on screen, or to reveal a thought process that the audience found baffling. The most notorious example came after The Long Night, when Benioff explained that Arya killing the Night King was chosen because Jon doing it would be too expected. The statement revealed a creative philosophy that prioritized surprise over narrative coherence, a philosophy that directly contradicted the show's own history. The Red Wedding was not surprising because the show chose a random character to kill. It was surprising because the audience believed the rules of the story protected Robb Stark, and the show revealed that they did not. The surprise emerged from the narrative. It served the themes. Arya killing the Night King is a surprise that comes from outside the narrative, from the writer's room, not from the world of the story. The distinction is critical, and the fact that the showrunners did not seem to understand it was, for many viewers, more troubling than any individual plot decision. Another Inside the Episode segment had Benioff explaining Daenerys' decision to burn King's Landing by saying something along the lines of her seeing the Red Keep and it becoming personal for her. The reduction of one of the most significant character moments in the series to a spontaneous emotional reaction, explained in a behind-the-scenes featurette rather than dramatized on screen, encapsulates the storytelling failure of the entire season. The audience should not need the writers to explain why a character did what they did. The scene should do that work. If the scene does not do that work, no amount of post-hoc explanation can repair the damage. Benioff and Weiss created one of the greatest television shows ever made. They did something no one else had done. They brought epic fantasy to the mainstream in a way that was not just popular, but culturally dominant. For years, Game of Thrones was the most talked about show on television, arguably the most talked about show in the history of television. It won 59 Primetime Emmy Awards, more than any other scripted series. It generated billions in revenue for HBO. It launched careers, inspired dissertations, fueled a global tourism industry, and proved that fantasy could be prestige television. Benioff and Weiss deserve enormous credit for that achievement. The early seasons of the show are a masterclass in adaptation, in casting, in world-building, in the translation of a dense literary text to a visual medium. But the ending matters. The ending is what the audience carries with them. The ending is what determines whether a show lives on in the culture as a classic to be revisited and recommended, or fades into a cautionary tale about squandered potential. And the ending of Game of Thrones is not just disappointing. It is so disappointing that it has fundamentally altered the show's cultural legacy. This is perhaps the most remarkable and most instructive consequence of Season 8's failure. Game of Thrones, in its prime, was inescapable. The Red Wedding generated headlines in newspapers that had never covered a television show before. The Battle of the Bastards trended worldwide. Every Monday after a new episode aired, the show dominated social media, water cooler conversations, and internet discourse. People who had never watched a fantasy show in their lives were invested in the fate of these characters and this world. After the finale aired on May 19, 2019, the show essentially vanished from the cultural conversation. Not immediately, but with a speed that would have been unthinkable for a property of its scale. People did not rewatch it. People did not recommend it to friends. People did not buy the box sets and marathon the series the way they did with Breaking Bad or The Wire or The Sopranos. The show that had defined a decade of television became, almost overnight, the show people used as a reference point for how an ending can destroy everything that came before. Think about what that means in practical terms. The rewatch value of a serialized narrative depends on the promise that the investment will pay off. You watch the early seasons knowing that the threads will converge, that the setups will have payoffs, that the journey will be worth the destination. When the destination is a disappointment, the entire journey is retroactively diminished. Knowing that Daenerys' arc ends in a rushed, unconvincing descent into tyranny makes her earlier scenes less enjoyable, not more. Knowing that Jon's parentage means nothing makes every scene of mystery about his mother less intriguing and more frustrating. Knowing that Bran becomes king for reasons the show cannot articulate makes his scenes in earlier seasons feel not like foreshadowing, but like wasted time. The show that was once the universal recommendation, you have to watch Game of Thrones, became the show with the universal caveat, you have to watch Game of Thrones, but the ending is terrible, and the caveat kills the recommendation, because who wants to invest 73 hours of their life in a story that does not stick the landing? The show's inability to deliver a satisfying conclusion did not just fail the existing audience, it prevented the show from acquiring the new audiences that sustain a classic across decades. Breaking Bad is still gaining new viewers years after its finale because the finale was a satisfying capstone. Game of Thrones is not, because its finale is a warning. This is the ultimate cost of rushing. Not just a bad final season, but the erosion of everything the good seasons built. The characters who were once beloved are now remembered for how they were diminished. The moments that once defined a generation of television viewing are now seen through the lens of their eventual pointlessness. The show that once proved fantasy could be taken seriously now serves as evidence that even the greatest stories can be undone by their endings. And yet, there is something that survives. There is something in those first 4 seasons that no amount of retrospective disappointment can fully erase. Ned Stark's execution, the Red Wedding, Tyrion's trial, the climb of the wall, Oberyn versus the Mountain, Hardhome, the door that Hodor held. These moments are seared into the collective memory of anyone who watched them, and they remain extraordinary. The acting, the writing, the direction, the music. In those moments, Game of Thrones was the best show on television by a margin so wide that no other show was visible behind it. The tragedy of Season 8 is not that it erased these moments. It cannot. They happened. They are real. The tragedy is that it denied them their proper context. A great moment in a great story gains power from the story around it. The Red Wedding is devastating not just because of what happens, but because of everything that led to it and everything that follows from it. It is a hinge point in a vast, intricate narrative machine. When the machine breaks, the hinge still exists, but it is no longer connected to anything. It becomes an isolated moment of greatness in a story that could not sustain its own ambitions. That is what Game of Thrones Season 8 did to Game of Thrones. It disconnected the machine. It took the hinges off the doors and left them hanging in empty frames. It took a story that asked its audience to pay attention, to invest, to care, and it told that audience, in its final hours, that the attention was wasted, the investment was misplaced, and the caring was naive. There is a scene in the series finale where Tyrion walks through the ruins of King's Landing. The streets are ash, the buildings are hollow shells, the people are gone. He walks alone through the destruction, and the camera follows him, and the silence is profound. He finds Jaime and Cersei beneath the rubble, and he weeps. That scene works, in spite of everything. Peter Dinklage sells the grief with a physicality that transcends the writing. His shoulders shake, his face crumbles. The man who always had a quip, who always had an argument, who always had a way to talk himself out of any corner, has nothing to say. His brother is dead. His sister is dead. The city is dead. And Tyrion kneels in the rubble and cries, and it is one of the rawest moments in the entire series, because for once, the show is not rushing past the emotion to get to the next plot point. It sits with Tyrion in the ash, and it lets him feel it. It is tempting to read that scene as a metaphor. Tyrion walking through the ruins of King's Landing. The audience walking through the ruins of a show they loved. The destruction not caused by an external enemy, but by the people in charge, by the ones who held the fire. Daenerys did not need to burn the city. Benioff and Weiss did not need to rush the ending. Both acts of destruction were choices, and both left rubble where something beautiful used to stand. But metaphors can be too neat, and this one risks being unfair. Benioff and Weiss are not villains. They are not incompetent. They are two writers who took on one of the most ambitious projects in the history of their medium and carried it further than anyone had a right to expect. They created a show that changed television. They adapted material that every studio had considered unadaptable. They cast actors who became icons. They built a world that captivated hundreds of millions of people. And when they ran out of road, when the books they were adapting ceased to exist, when the source material that had been their foundation was no longer available, they did the best they could with what they had. Their best, in Season 8, was not good enough. That is not a moral failing. It is a creative one. And creative failures, unlike moral ones, can be learned from. What Season 8 teaches is this. Endings are not optional. They are not an afterthought, not a formality, not the boring part you rush through to get to the next project. The ending is the lens through which the entire story is viewed in retrospect. A great ending elevates everything that came before. A poor ending diminishes it. And a rushed ending, an ending that does not give its characters the time and space to arrive at their destinations organically, can destroy a legacy that took years to build. There is a moment in the very first episode of Game of Thrones, Winter is Coming, that aired on April 17, 2011, where Ned Stark executes a deserter from the Night's Watch. The man has fled south because he saw the White Walkers beyond the wall. He is terrified. He is telling the truth. And Ned kills him anyway, because the law demands it, and Ned Stark is a man who follows the law even when the law is wrong. It is a small scene, it takes less than 3 minutes, and it establishes, in those 3 minutes, the entire moral framework of the show. This is a world where honor has consequences, where doing the right thing and doing the smart thing are rarely the same, where the rules people live by are not abstractions, but forces that shape and sometimes destroy the people who follow them. That scene works because the show trusts the audience to extract the meaning from the behavior. It does not have Ned turn to the camera and explain that he believes in duty above all else. It does not have another character comment on what a rigid, honorable man Ned is. It shows you a man swinging a sword, and it lets you draw your own conclusions. That is the grammar of great television. Show, do not tell. Trust the audience. Let meaning emerge from action. Season 8 reverses this grammar. It tells instead of showing. It explains instead of revealing. It has characters state their motivations in dialogue, rather than expressing them through behavior. Tyrion tells Jon that Daenerys is dangerous. He does not show Jon discovering this through his own observations and his own moral reasoning. Daenerys tells Jon that she will rule through fear. She does not show a gradual hardening that the audience can track and understand. Bran tells Tyrion his story off-screen, and then Tyrion tells the assembled lords that Bran has the best story, and the audience is expected to accept a second-hand summary of a conversation they were not permitted to hear as justification for the most important political decision in the show's history. This shift from showing to telling is not a minor aesthetic complaint. It is the fundamental breakdown of the show's storytelling method. Game of Thrones built its reputation on the principle that its audience was intelligent enough to read between the lines. The show presented complex situations and trusted viewers to parse the motivations, the subtext, the unspoken tensions. When Cersei smiled at Tyrion across a dinner table, the audience understood the threat without anyone saying a word. When Littlefinger whispered in Sansa's ear, the audience tracked the manipulation in real time. When Tywin Lannister sat at the head of a table and said nothing while others argued, the audience felt his power radiating from his silence. The final season has none of this subtlety. Characters announce their feelings, they declare their intentions, they explain the themes of the show to each other in speeches that sound more like lectures than dialogue. Tyrion's speech about the power of stories in the finale is the most egregious example, but it is far from the only one. The show that once trusted subtext abandons it entirely in its final hours, as if the writers no longer believe the audience can follow a thought that is not spelled out in capital letters. Let us spend more time with the deaths that do not work in Season 8, because the handling of death is one of the clearest barometers of a show's narrative health. In the early seasons, every major death served multiple narrative purposes simultaneously. Ned Stark's execution ended one story and launched a dozen others. It revealed the true nature of Joffrey, the political landscape of King's Landing, the vulnerability of honor in a corrupt system, and the catalyst for the War of the Five Kings. The Red Wedding killed Robb and Catelyn Stark, and simultaneously proved that Tywin Lannister's method of winning wars, through treachery rather than battle, was the dominant strategy in Westeros. Every death meant something beyond itself. Compare that to the deaths in Season 8. Missandei is captured off-screen during Euron's ambush and executed on the walls of King's Landing in Episode 4, The Last of the Starks. She is beheaded by the mountain while Cersei watches, and Daenerys looks on in helpless fury. Missandei's last word is Dracarys, fire, an implicit command for Daenerys to burn them all. The scene is meant to be the emotional tipping point that pushes Daenerys toward her destruction of King's Landing. And on the surface, it does its job. The moment is visceral. Nathalie Emmanuel's final performance is dignified and heartbreaking. The rage on Emilia Clarke's face as she watches her closest friend die is palpable. But the mechanics of how Missandei arrives at that wall are indefensible. Euron's fleet ambushes Daenerys in open water. Rhaegal is killed, Daenerys' ships are destroyed, and somehow, in the chaos of a naval battle, Euron's forces specifically capture Missandei, not Tyrion, who is also on the ships. Not Grey Worm, not anyone else. Missandei, The one character whose death will hurt Daenerys the most is plucked from the wreckage by a villain who has no way of knowing who she is or why she matters. The show needs Missandei dead to fuel Daenerys' rage, so Missandei dies. The plot dictates the event, and the event has no organic connection to the characters or the world. Rhaegal's death in the same episode follows the same pattern. Daenerys is flying above Dragonstone. She has 2 dragons. The show needs her to have 1 dragon for the Battle of King's Landing, because 2 dragons would make the battle too easy and reduce the dramatic tension. So Rhaegal must die, and the mechanism of his death is Euron firing 3 scorpion bolts from a fleet that is hidden behind a rock formation. The bolts hit with perfect accuracy from an extreme distance, killing a dragon in mid-flight. 1 episode later, in The Bells, Daenerys dodges dozens of scorpion bolts with ease, destroying the entire fleet without taking a single hit. The inconsistency is not a minor continuity error. It is a fundamental break in the show's internal logic. The scorpions are as powerful or as weak as the plot needs them to be in any given scene. This is what happens when a show writes backward from its desired endpoints, rather than forward from its established rules. The show knows that Daenerys needs to have only 1 dragon in the final battle, so it kills a dragon. The show knows that Daenerys needs to be able to destroy King's Landing, so it makes the scorpions useless. The 2 needs contradict each other. If the scorpions can kill a dragon easily, they should be able to threaten Daenerys in the final battle. If they cannot threaten her in the final battle, they should not have been able to kill a dragon easily. The show resolves this contradiction by ignoring it and hoping the audience does not notice. The audience notices. Varys' death is another casualty of this approach. Lord Varys, the Spider, the Master of Whisperers, one of the most intelligent and careful operators in the history of Westeros, is executed by Dragonfire in The Bells for plotting against Daenerys. And his plotting is so clumsy, so transparent, so utterly unlike the character the audience has known for 8 seasons, that his death feels less like a tragic consequence and more like the show clearing its desk before the finale. Varys openly discusses treason with Tyrion. He writes letters revealing Jon's identity and leaves them sitting on his desk. He attempts to undermine Daenerys through one of his contacts, and the show reveals this in a throwaway scene that many viewers missed on first viewing. This is the same Varys who, in earlier seasons, operated a spy network that spanned 2 continents. The same Varys who played the long game for decades, manipulating events from the shadows while everyone around him underestimated the eunuch with no lands, no title, and no army. The same Varys who told Tyrion that power resides where men believe it resides, and who understood better than anyone in the show that the Game of Thrones is won through patience, information, and the careful cultivation of alliances over years. That Varys would never discuss treason openly. That Varys would never leave written evidence of his plotting where it could be found. That Varys would never move against a queen with 2 other advisors who could report his betrayal before his plans were in place. The Varys of Season 8 is not the same character as the Varys of Seasons 1 through 6. He is a plot device wearing the old character's face. We are deep into the night now, and the story goes on. Stay with us. There is a character we have not yet discussed who embodies, perhaps more than any other, the decline in the show's writing quality across the final seasons. That character is Euron Greyjoy. In George R.R. Martin's novels, Euron Greyjoy is one of the most terrifying figures in the story. He is a pirate king who has sailed to the edges of the known world. He has visited the ruins of Valyria, a journey that is supposed to be fatal. He possesses a horn that can bind dragons to his will. He practices dark magic. He mutilates his own crew, cutting out their tongues so they cannot speak of what they have seen. In the books, Euron is a genuine force of cosmic menace, a man who seems to exist outside the normal rules of the world, a character who might represent a threat as great as the White Walkers themselves. In the show, Euron is a smirking pirate who makes dirty jokes. The character was introduced in Season 6, played by Pilu Asbæk, and from the beginning, the show stripped him of every quality that made his book counterpart compelling. No horn, no dark magic, no cosmic menace. What remained was a swaggering, one-dimensional villain, whose primary characteristics were his libido and his convenient ability to show up exactly where the plot needed him. He ambushes Yara's fleet in Season 7. He ambushes Daenerys' fleet in Season 8. He kills Rhaegal with impossible accuracy. He washes up on the exact stretch of beach where Jaime happens to be walking, and fights him to the death in a scene that serves no narrative purpose whatsoever. Euron's fight with Jaime in The Bells is one of the most bewildering scenes in the final season. Jaime is trying to reach Cersei in the Red Keep. Euron emerges from the water and challenges him. They fight. Euron stabs Jaime twice. Jaime kills Euron. Euron's last words are a boast about being the man who killed Jaime Lannister, which is incorrect since Jaime walks away from the fight and dies later under rubble. The scene exists for no discernible reason. It does not advance the plot. It does not reveal character. It does not serve the themes. It is filler masquerading as action, a fight scene added because the episode needed another action beat and Euron was available. The contrast between book Euron and show Euron is instructive because it illustrates a broader pattern. When the show had Martin's text to draw from, its villains were complex, psychologically real, and terrifying in ways that went beyond physical threat. Tywin Lannister, Joffrey Baratheon, Ramsay Bolton, Roose Bolton, the High Sparrow. These characters were villains who operated within a recognizable moral framework, even when that framework was monstrous. They had reasons for what they did. They had depth. You could understand their logic even as you were repelled by their actions. When the show ran out of Martin's text, its villains became cartoons. Euron is a cartoon. The Night King, for all the visual spectacle he brings, is a cartoon, a silent, one-note antagonist with no dialogue, no motivation beyond destruction, and no personality whatsoever. The show that once gave its villains more humanity than most shows give their heroes ended up populating its final seasons with antagonists who would not be out of place in a superhero film. Let us talk about the geography of Season 8 and how the show's relationship with physical space collapsed in its final episodes. In the early seasons of Game of Thrones, geography was a character. The show opened every episode with an animated title sequence that tracked the locations featured in that episode on a three-dimensional map. The map was not decorative. It was a narrative tool. It told the audience where each story was happening relative to every other story. It established that Westeros was vast, that travel took time, that distance was a factor in every political and military calculation. Characters moved through this geography at human speed. Robert Baratheon's journey from King's Landing to Winterfell took an entire month, and the show made that journey feel real. Arya's wandering through the Riverlands with the Hound took most of 2 seasons. Brienne and Jaime's trek from the Riverlands to King's Landing was a season-long odyssey. The time characters spent traveling was not wasted time. It was character time. Some of the show's finest scenes happened on the road. Arya and the Hound sharing meals. Jaime and Brienne arguing in the wilderness. Tyrion and Bronn trading barbs on the way to the Eyrie. The geography gave the characters space to breathe, to talk, to reveal themselves. By Season 7, this geography had collapsed. Ravens fly from the Wall to Dragonstone in what appears to be hours. Daenerys flies from Dragonstone to beyond the Wall in what appears to be less than a day. Armies move from one end of the continent to the other between scenes. The map that once constrained and shaped the story becomes a suggestion, a decoration, a thing the show acknowledges the existence of without allowing it to impose any limits on the narrative. Season 8 completes this collapse. In The Last of the Starks, Jon and the Northern forces march from Winterfell to King's Landing, a journey that should take weeks, in the space of a scene transition. Daenerys sails from White Harbor to Dragonstone and is ambushed by Euron's fleet off the coast, and the timeline of this journey is completely opaque. Jaime rides from Winterfell to King's Landing in what appears to be a matter of days. Characters are where the plot needs them to be, when the plot needs them to be there, and the physical reality of the world, the distances, the terrain, the logistics of moving armies and fleets, is treated as an inconvenience to be hand-waved rather than a constraint to be honored. This matters because geography was always a proxy for consequence in Game of Thrones. Distance meant time. Time meant that decisions could not be undone, that help might not arrive, that the world was larger than any one person's ability to control it. When Robb Stark marched south, he was committing to a campaign that would take months. When Daenerys lingered in Meereen, she was choosing to delay her arrival in Westeros. When Jon went beyond the Wall, he was leaving the realm of civilization for a place where the rules were different. Geography made choices permanent and made the world feel real. When geography stops mattering, choices stop having weight, and the world stops feeling real, and the story becomes a series of events rather than a chain of consequences. There is another dimension to the failure of Season 8 that deserves attention, and that is the show's treatment of its own themes. Game of Thrones, at its best, was a show about the nature of power. Not power as an abstraction, but power as a lived experience. Who has it, who wants it, how they get it, what it costs them, and what it does to the people it is exercised upon. Every major character in the show existed in a specific relationship to power. Cersei craved it. Ned was destroyed by his refusal to play its games. Tyrion understood it intellectually, but could never hold it permanently. Jon was granted it reluctantly and wore it uncomfortably. Daenerys believed she was entitled to it and confused her entitlement with justice. Littlefinger saw it as the only thing worth pursuing. Varys claimed to serve the realm rather than any individual, but his idea of the realm was itself a form of power, the power to decide what was best for millions of people without their consent. The show explored these different relationships to power with a sophistication that was genuinely rare in popular entertainment. It did not take sides. It did not declare one character's approach to power correct and another's wrong. It presented the full spectrum of human engagement with authority and let the audience draw their own conclusions. This moral ambiguity was the show's greatest intellectual achievement. In a culture saturated with stories where the good guys win and the bad guys lose, Game of Thrones said there are no good guys, there are no bad guys, there are only people, and the systems they build, and the damage those systems do. Season 8 collapses this complexity into something much simpler. Daenerys is bad, Jon is good, Tyrion is wise, Bran is chosen. The show that once refused to assign moral categories to its characters spends its final episodes doing exactly that. Daenerys' destruction of King's Landing is not presented as a complex moral event with multiple perspectives and no easy answers. It is presented as madness, full stop. Jon's killing of Daenerys is not presented as an agonizing moral choice, with genuine costs on both sides. It is presented as the obviously right thing to do. The show that once made power seem impossibly complicated makes it look, in the end, remarkably simple. The most telling example of this thematic collapse is the scene in the finale where Tyrion explains why Bran should be king. His argument is, essentially, that stories unite people, and Bran has the best story. Set aside the question of whether Bran actually has the best story. The deeper problem is what this argument reveals about the show's final understanding of power. Tyrion is saying that the best ruler is the one with the most compelling narrative. This is, in a certain light, a statement about the power of storytelling itself. But in the context of the show, a show that has spent 8 seasons demonstrating that power comes from armies, money, alliances, geography, legitimacy, and the willingness to use violence, the argument is absurd. Nobody in the Dragon Pit scene challenges it. Nobody asks how a wheelchair-bound man who claims to be a mystical time-traveling raven will command the loyalty of armies, manage the economy of a continent, or navigate the political realities of governing 7 kingdoms. The assembled lords simply agree, because the script needs them to agree, and the scene ends. There is another dimension to the Dragon Pit scene that makes it even more frustrating. The assembled lords and ladies who vote on Bran's kingship include characters the audience has never met. The new Prince of Dorne has no name, no backstory, no introduction. He is simply there, representing one of the most important kingdoms in Westeros, and he says nothing of substance. Edmure Tully, who has been imprisoned since the Red Wedding era, stands up to nominate himself, and is immediately shut down by Sansa in a moment played for comedy. Robin Arryn is present, grown up and barely recognizable, and he says nothing. Yara Greyjoy, who was promised independence for the Iron Islands by Daenerys, does not demand that independence when the opportunity presents itself. The representatives of the Reach, the Westerlands, and the Stormlands are anonymous figures who vote for Bran without explanation. This is supposed to be the scene that redefines the governance of Westeros. This is the moment where the wheel is broken, where the cycle of dynastic violence ends, where a new form of political organization emerges from the ashes of the old. And it is played as a brief council meeting where everyone agrees without debate, dissent, or drama. The show that once devoted entire episodes to political negotiations. Think of the parley at Storm's End between Stannis and Renly, or the negotiations between Daenerys and the slavers of Astapor, or the trial of Tyrion Lannister with its layers of legal and political maneuvering, resolves the ultimate political question of the series in a single scene that contains less political tension than a school board meeting. The lords do not ask how the succession will work after Bran. They do not negotiate terms. They do not demand concessions for their kingdoms. They do not raise the obvious question of why the North gets to secede while the other kingdoms do not. They do not question whether a man who claims to be an omniscient, time-traveling mystic is a suitable ruler for a feudal kingdom. They just vote. Aye. And it is done. The show that built its identity on the messy, complicated, often violent reality of political power resolves its central political question as if it were a formality. The wheel was not broken, it was simply forgotten. The show that once treated political power with the seriousness of a graduate seminar resolves its central political question with a fairy tale. The best story wins. That is not just a disappointing ending. It is a thematic betrayal. It takes the show's most sophisticated idea, that power is complex, contingent, and never stable, and replaces it with the simplest possible answer. The best story wins. It is the kind of resolution you would expect from a show that never took politics seriously in the first place. For a show that made politics its reason for existing, it is a surrender. Let us also talk about the women of Westeros in Season 8, because the season's treatment of its female characters is one of the most consistent and most troubling patterns in its failures. Daenerys, as we have discussed at length, goes from the show's most powerful female character to a genocidal tyrant in the space of 2 episodes, driven by jealousy, isolation, and what the show implies is hereditary Targaryen madness. Whatever the intended thematic purpose of this arc, its execution reduces one of television's most complex women to a stereotype, the scorned woman who burns the world because the man she loves does not love her back in the way she needs. Cersei, who was one of the most active and dynamic characters in the show's history, a woman who orchestrated the destruction of the Great Sept of Baelor, who outmaneuvered every rival who underestimated her, who seized the Iron Throne through sheer ruthless will, spends her entire final season standing on balconies. She has fewer lines in Season 8 than in any previous season. She makes no major decisions. She takes no significant actions. She watches the battle unfold from the Red Keep, drinks wine, and waits for the outcome to come to her. And then she dies in a basement. The show's greatest female villain is given nothing to do in the show's final act. Brienne, who was one of the most beloved characters in the series, a woman who defined herself by her honor, her skill, and her refusal to be diminished by a world that could not accept her, is reduced to a crying woman in a courtyard, abandoned by the man she loves. The scene where Jaime leaves Brienne is painful to watch, but not in the way the show intends. It is painful because it takes a character who spent 7 seasons refusing to be defined by her relationships with men and defines her, in her final significant scene, entirely by her relationship with a man. Brienne's last major moment is not a feat of arms, not an act of honor, not a demonstration of the qualities that made her extraordinary. It is standing in the cold, weeping, while a man walks away from her. Sansa's arc in Season 8 is arguably the most successful of the female characters, ending with her as queen in the north. But even Sansa's arc carries a troubling moment. In a scene in The Last of the Starks, Sansa tells the Hound that she is not the same girl she was, that the abuse she suffered, from Joffrey, from Ramsay, from Littlefinger, made her who she is. The implication is that her trauma was a necessary crucible, that she had to be brutalized to become strong. This is a common narrative trope, and the show deploys it without interrogation. It does not ask whether Sansa could have become strong without being raped and beaten. It simply presents her suffering as the price of her power, and the scene treats this as a moment of strength rather than examining the troubling implications of the idea. Arya kills the Night King, which is a moment of triumph, but it comes at the cost of Jon's entire arc, and is framed as a surprise twist, rather than the organic culmination of her own story. And after killing the Night King, Arya's role in the final 3 episodes is primarily to run through the streets of King's Landing while buildings collapse around her, surviving the destruction by luck and plot armor. Her decision to sail west of Westeros in the finale is presented as a choice, but it also reads as the show having no idea what to do with a female character it has made too powerful to contain within its remaining story. The pattern is clear. The show's female characters, who were for years among the most complex and well-written women on television, are in the final season either diminished, sidelined, or resolved in ways that rely on stereotypes the show once refused to engage with. This is not a coincidence. It is a consequence of the same compression that damages everything else. Developing a character's arc takes time. Avoiding stereotypes takes care. When the show has neither time nor care to spare, its characters default to the simplest available templates, and for female characters in a patriarchal genre, those templates tend to be reductive. There is one more element of the Season 8 experience that deserves discussion before we arrive at the conclusion, and that is the phenomenon of the collective watch. Game of Thrones was, more than any other show of its era, a communal experience. It was the last great water cooler show, the last series that a critical mass of the culture watched simultaneously and discussed the next morning. In the age of streaming, where shows are released all at once and consumed on individual schedules, Game of Thrones held the line for appointment television. Every Sunday night at 9 o'clock, millions of people sat down together, in living rooms, in bars, at watch parties, and experienced the same story at the same time. The internet was not just a secondary platform for discussion, it was an integral part of the experience. Theories were shared, details were dissected, predictions were made and tracked. The show existed in a feedback loop with its audience that amplified every triumph and every failure. This communal dimension made Season 8's failures exponentially more visible. In a binge-watch model, a disappointing episode is absorbed and forgotten as the viewer moves to the next. In a weekly model, a disappointing episode sits in the audience's consciousness for 7 full days. Every flaw is examined, every plot hole is cataloged. Every disappointing choice is debated, defended, and attacked across hundreds of thousands of social media posts, Reddit threads, YouTube videos, and podcast episodes. The weekly release schedule that had been Game of Thrones' greatest asset, the engine that powered its cultural dominance, became, in Season 8, its greatest liability. Every week brought a new episode, and every new episode brought new disappointments, and the collective processing of those disappointments built into a wave of frustration that no show could survive. The long night aired, and the internet spent a week complaining about the darkness and the battle tactics and the Night King's death. The Last of the Starks aired, and the internet spent a week mocking the Starbucks cup and Rhaegal's death and Jaime's departure. The Bells aired, and the internet spent a week raging about Daenerys' turn and Cersei's death and Euron's fight with Jaime. By the time the Iron Throne aired, the audience was not just disappointed. They were exhausted. They had spent a month processing escalating failures, each one compounding the last, and the finale was asked to redeem a season that had already lost the audience's trust. The petition to remake Season 8, with competent writers, reached 1.8 million signatures. That number is worth sitting with. 1.8 million people signed a petition they knew would accomplish nothing, because the act of signing was itself a form of expression. It was a way of saying I cared about this story, and the story let me down, and I want the people responsible to know it. The petition was dismissed by some as entitlement, as the audience demanding that creators cater to their preferences rather than telling the story they wanted to tell. Kit Harington called the petition idiotic. Sophie Turner suggested that the petition was disrespectful to the cast and crew who had worked so hard on the season. These responses are understandable, but also miss the point. The petition was not a literal demand for a do-over. It was a measure of grief. The audience was grieving the loss of a show they loved, and the petition was the only mechanism available to them for expressing that grief at scale. People do not sign petitions about shows they do not care about. They do not write thousands of words analyzing the failures of a narrative they are indifferent to. The intensity of the backlash was, as Weiss himself acknowledged in later interviews, a reflection of the intensity of the love. People cared about Game of Thrones more than they had ever cared about a television show, and when it failed them, they felt the failure more deeply than any television failure before. There is a thought experiment that clarifies the scope of what was lost. Imagine you are explaining Game of Thrones to someone who has never seen it. You tell them about the political intrigue, the complex characters, the willingness to kill protagonists, the sprawling world, the 8 seasons of television that captivated the planet. And then imagine the question they will inevitably ask: is it worth watching? Before Season 8 aired, the answer was an unqualified yes, one of the greatest television experiences ever produced, a must-watch. After the finale, the answer requires a paragraph of caveats. The first 4 seasons are incredible. Seasons 5 and 6 are uneven but still have extraordinary moments. Season 7 is fun but flawed, and Season 8 is a disaster. But you should probably still watch it because the highs are so high. Just be prepared for the ending. That caveat has killed more potential viewings of Game of Thrones than any other factor. The show that once sold itself, that required no qualification, that was recommended with the fervor of a religious conversion, now comes with a warning label. And the warning label is not about content, not about the violence, the sexual assault, the moral complexity. The warning label is about quality. The show gets worse. It does not stick the landing. The ending will make you angry. No recommendation can survive that caveat intact. The numbers tell the story. Game of Thrones was not just a critical hit. It was a cultural juggernaut. The Season 8 premiere drew over 17 million viewers across all platforms. The finale drew over 19 million. These are numbers that broadcast networks dream about, achieved by a premium cable channel that required a subscription to access. The show generated billions in merchandise revenue. It drove tourism to filming locations in Northern Ireland, Croatia, Spain, and Iceland. It inspired a generation of fantasy television, from The Witcher to The Wheel of Time to House of the Dragon itself. The show was, by every available metric, the most successful original drama in the history of premium television. And then it stopped mattering, not gradually, the way most shows fade from the conversation. Abruptly, the finale aired on May 19, 2019, and within weeks, the cultural conversation had moved on. There were no sustained discussions about the show's legacy. There were no rankings of the greatest Game of Thrones moments that did not quickly devolve into arguments about the ending. There was no sustained impulse to revisit the show, to rewatch it with fresh eyes, to discover new layers in its early episodes. The conversation, when it occurred at all, was dominated by one question: what went wrong? Game of Thrones went from the show everyone watched to the show everyone referenced as a failure. That transformation happened faster than anyone, fans, critics, HBO executives, or the showrunners themselves, could have predicted. Compare this to The Sopranos, which ended in 2007. The finale of The Sopranos was one of the most divisive hours of television ever produced. The cut to black that ended the series provoked outrage, confusion, and debate that continues to this day. But The Sopranos grew in stature after its ending. The debate fed the show's reputation rather than diminishing it. People rewatched. People recommended. People argued about what the ending meant, and those arguments drew new viewers into the conversation. The Sopranos' ending was ambiguous, but it was clearly the product of a deliberate artistic vision, and the audience's respect for that vision sustained the show's reputation across decades. Game of Thrones' ending is not ambiguous. It is clear. Bran is king. Jon is exiled. Daenerys is dead. The clarity of the ending means there is nothing to debate except whether it was good or bad, and the consensus, with the vehemence of 1.8 million petition signatures behind it, is that it was bad. There is no mystery to sustain interest. There is no artistic ambiguity to generate productive disagreement. There is just a series of endpoints that most of the audience found unsatisfying, arrived at through a process most of the audience found rushed, executed with a level of craft that most of the audience found insufficient. The conversation is closed. House of the Dragon, the prequel series set in the same world, premiered on HBO in 2022 and proved that the appetite for Westeros had not disappeared entirely. The show drew large audiences and generally positive reviews. But its existence also underscored the damage Season 8 had done. The marketing for House of the Dragon had to quietly distance itself from the memory of Game of Thrones' ending. Viewers approached the new show with a wariness that would have been unthinkable before 2019. The franchise survived, but it survived wounded, and the wound was entirely self-inflicted. There is a ghost that haunts every conversation about Game of Thrones Season 8, and that ghost is George R.R. Martin. The author of A Song of Ice and Fire has not finished his book series. The Winds of Winter, the sixth novel, has been anticipated since A Dance with Dragons was published in 2011. As of the making of this video, it has not been released. This means that the show outpaced its source material and had to construct an ending without the roadmap that Martin's completed text would have provided. Martin has spoken, in interviews and blog posts, about the differences between his vision and the show's execution. He has been diplomatic, careful not to criticize Benioff and Weiss directly, but the subtext of his statements suggests a man who watched his creation arrive at destinations he recognized through a journey he did not. Martin reportedly told the showrunners the broad strokes of his planned ending: Daenerys burning King's Landing, Bran becoming king, Jon being exiled, during a meeting in 2013. But broad strokes are not a novel. Broad strokes are not the thousands of pages of internal logic, character development, thematic layering, and narrative infrastructure that make an ending feel inevitable rather than imposed. Martin gave them the what. He could not give them the how, because he had not written it yet. This raises a question that is uncomfortable but necessary. Should the show have waited? Should Benioff and Weiss have paused production, taken a year off, 2 years off, as long as necessary, to give Martin time to finish the books and provide them with the complete text they needed? The answer, in practical terms, is almost certainly no. The actors were aging. The production schedule was grueling. The financial pressures of keeping a show of this scale in hiatus would have been enormous. and there was no guarantee that Martin would finish in any time frame. The fact that The Winds of Winter remains unpublished years later confirms that waiting was not a realistic option. But the question illuminates the fundamental problem. Game of Thrones was a show that succeeded because of its source material, and when that source material ran out, the show did not have the writing infrastructure to replicate what Martin had provided. This is not an insult to Benioff and Weiss. Martin is one of the great literary architects of the modern era. His plotting is the work of decades. Expecting two television writers, however talented, to replicate that level of narrative engineering on a production timeline is asking the impossible. The failure was not of talent, it was of circumstance. The show needed something that did not exist, the completed books, and it tried to build a substitute out of outlines and endpoints, and the substitute was not strong enough to bear the weight. There is a version of the ending of A Song of Ice and Fire that lives in George R.R. Martin's head, and, perhaps, in his manuscripts. A version where Daenerys' descent is a slow, agonizing transformation that the reader watches from inside, where every step toward the burning of King's Landing feels both horrifying and inevitable. A version where Bran's ascension to the throne carries the weight of the entire mythological framework of the old gods, and the children of the forest and the Weirwood network. A version where Jon's exile is not a punishment, but a choice that grows from his understanding of who he is and what he wants. A version where the ending is not just an endpoint, but a statement about the nature of power, stories, and the human capacity for both destruction and renewal. That version may never exist outside Martin's imagination, but its ghost haunts Season 8, and the ghost is more compelling than what actually made it to the screen. There is a lesson in all of this that extends beyond Game of Thrones, beyond television, beyond entertainment. The lesson is about what happens when the people responsible for a story stop serving the story and start serving their own timeline. Benioff and Weiss wanted to be done. They had been working on Game of Thrones for more than a decade. They were tired. They had other projects they were excited about. These are human feelings, and they deserve empathy. But the story did not care about their feelings. The story had its own needs, its own rhythms, its own demands. The story needed 10 episodes in its final season. The story needed time for Daenerys to descend. The story needed space for Jon's parentage to matter. The story needed room for Bran's ascension to make sense. The story needed breathing room between its biggest moments, so that each one could land with the weight it deserved. The story needed what the storytellers would not give it. And so the story broke. This is not a unique phenomenon. History is full of examples of ambitious narratives that stumbled at the finish line. The final season of Lost, the final chapters of numerous long-running manga and comic series, the concluding installments of beloved film franchises. But Game of Thrones occupies a unique position in this gallery of disappointed endings because of the sheer scale of the investment, both financial and emotional, that preceded it. No show had ever commanded this level of global attention. No show had ever asked for this depth of audience commitment. And no show had ever so thoroughly squandered the goodwill it had earned. There is something worth acknowledging before we reach the end of this analysis. Amid all the failures of Season 8, there are viewers who found the ending satisfying, or at least defensible. There are critics who argue that the broad strokes were correct, that Daenerys' turn was foreshadowed, that Bran becoming king carries thematic weight, that Jon's exile is poetically fitting. There are people who believe the backlash was excessive, fueled by social media dynamics that amplify negativity and reward the performance of outrage. These perspectives deserve respect, not because they are necessarily correct, but because the experience of art is personal, and dismissing someone else's genuine emotional response to a story is never productive. The purpose of this analysis has never been to declare that Season 8 is irredeemable, or that people who enjoyed it were wrong to do so. The purpose has been to examine, with specificity and care, why the season failed for the majority of its audience, and what the nature of those failures reveals about the craft of storytelling. The evidence, examined in detail, points consistently in the same direction. The season was too short. The arcs were too compressed. The writing could not sustain the ambition of the plot. The craft that once defined the show, the patience, the subtlety, the trust in the audience, was abandoned in favor of spectacle and speed. These are not matters of taste, they are matters of craft. And while taste is subjective, craft can be evaluated on its own terms. The show that once set the standard for serialized drama ended as a reminder that standards, once set, carry obligations. The audience that Game of Thrones cultivated across 8 seasons was an audience trained to expect the highest level of narrative craft. That audience was not unreasonable in expecting the final season to meet the standard the show itself had established. They were not entitled. They were attentive. And the difference between an entitled audience and an attentive one is the difference between a show that never earned devotion and one that did. Game of Thrones earned it, completely. And that is exactly why the loss stings the way it does. The conversation about Game of Thrones Season 8 will continue for years. It has already outlived the show itself, becoming a permanent fixture in the discourse about serialized storytelling, about the relationship between creators and audiences, about the risks of adaptation and the perils of outpacing your source material. Whenever a beloved show enters its final season, the specter of Game of Thrones hovers over the proceedings. Do not pull a Game of Thrones has become shorthand for, do not rush your ending, do not abandon your characters, do not let the spectacle overwhelm the story. The show that aspired to be the greatest fantasy epic ever televised became, in its final act, the greatest cautionary tale. And the strange, sad thing is that the cautionary tale might be the show's most enduring legacy. Not the Red Wedding, not the Battle of the Bastards, not the Wall, or the Dragons, or the Iron Throne. The thing people remember most about Game of Thrones, the thing that comes up first in any conversation about the show, is how it ended. The ending has become the story. And that, more than anything else, is the tragedy of Season 8. Game of Thrones deserved better than Season 8. Not because the fans demanded it, although they did. Not because the actors and crew who poured a decade of their lives into the production deserved it, although they did. But because the story itself deserved it. The story that began with a boy climbing a tower and seeing something he should not have seen. The story that taught a generation of viewers that actions have consequences and power is a game that everyone loses eventually. That story deserved an ending that honored its own intelligence, its own complexity, its own relentless commitment to treating the audience as partners rather than passengers. Instead, it got 6 episodes. 6 episodes to resolve a dozen major character arcs. 6 episodes to end the war against the dead and the war for the throne. 6 episodes to bring closure to the most complex narrative history in the history of television. It got a sprint where it needed a marathon. It got spectacle where it needed silence. It got plot where it needed people. And the result is a show that will be studied, for years to come, as the most vivid example of how a great story can fail at the finish line. Not because the people involved lacked talent. Not because the resources were insufficient. Not because the audience was unfair or ungrateful. But because the story was not given the time it needed to become what it was always capable of becoming. The bones of a masterpiece are there, scattered across the 6 episodes of Season 8. The foundation that the first 7 seasons built was strong enough to support an extraordinary ending. The characters were rich enough. The world was deep enough. The themes were powerful enough. All the ending needed was patience. All it needed was time. All it needed was the willingness to let the story breathe, to let the characters arrive at their destinations through the organic, incremental, deeply human process that had defined the show at its best. That willingness was not there, and so the story broke, and the legacy fractured, and the show that could have been remembered as the greatest television drama of its generation is remembered, instead, as the one that could not stick the landing. The Iron Throne sits in no throne room now. It is a puddle of metal on a stone floor. The show that was built around it is a similar kind of ruin, beautiful in places, heartbreaking in others, and never quite what it should have been at the end. But the ruins are still worth visiting. The early seasons are still masterful. The performances are still extraordinary, the music still haunts, and the questions the show raised, about power, about stories, about who gets to sit in the chair and why, those questions outlast the answers the show provided. Game of Thrones Season 8 aired in the spring of 2019. The Rotten Tomatoes score for the season sits at 55%, the lowest of any season by a margin of over 30 points. The petition to remake it gathered 1.8 million signatures. The cultural conversation moved on with a speed that stunned even the show's harshest critics. And the lesson sits there, in the rubble, for anyone willing to look at it. Endings matter, pacing matters, character matters, and no amount of spectacle, no budget, no Emmy, no dragon, can compensate for a story that does not take the time to land. The throne is melted, the story is told, the long night is over, and what remains is the memory of what the show was, and the shadow of what it could have been. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.